Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is McGregor and I was a sheriff for a small rural town in North America in the early 80s, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1987. I'd like to remain anonymous for the purposes of this story, as I most certainly never discussed these strange occurrences with anybody else in the force. Some of the stories sounded too crazy to be possibly true, and the last thing you need in the force is your credibility to be compromised, tarnished and subsequently left in tatters like confetti after a wedding. When that happens, invariably bang goes your career in the force, not to mention your esteemed, hard-earned reputation from years of dedicated work. So mentioning things that border on the paranormal or the fictitious is certainly not a good idea for someone in my position. I'm quite sure there are others exactly like me in the force who've experienced strange phenomenon, but I am in no doubt that they would keep their mouths shut, and rightly so. If someone were to tell me the same stories that I'm about to tell you and your listeners in this anonymous forum, in truth I would think they were barking mad, or they'd lost their marbles. The trouble is, when you've experienced the unexplainable yourself, it is almost impossible to fathom what you've actually seen. You almost always assume that you're going mad, or you've just been dreaming, because it really takes a huge paradigm shift to begin to appreciate that these things going on in the world that defy rational explanation do actually exist and are real, even though they may appear spurious. All my life I've lived in a small rustic rural town where all the locals were warm and friendly and everyone knew everyone. There was a great community spirit, and that is something that you can't get in a big city. There were several streets in our rural area that could almost pass for being suburban, although they weren't, as all the symmetrical Mediterranean-style houses were painted in bright colours like yellows, greens, blues, pinks and apricots. Most of the houses were very spacious and large, with wooden framed windows and glamorous front doors. Every house possessed a generous-sized backyard, entertainment area and swimming pool, and they were quite literally nestled away in the heart of the exquisite countryside. Everyone in the local area tended to take pride in the outdoor appearance of their homes, and during the summer and spring the front yards were filled with a kaleidoscope of pretty colours, from seasonal flowers, abundant roses and pretty shrubbery. Most of the houses overlooked ravishing views over rugged mountainous outcrops, rolling emerald green valleys, pasture land for horses and cows, meadows, and acre upon acre of ubiquitous resplendent forest that literally stretched back for miles, that was filled with towering oaks, maples, pines and spruce trees that were teeming with the indigenous wildlife in the area. It was not uncommon to find deer and even the odd bear frolicking around the garden, and provided they did not eat all our seasonal annuals, we enjoyed our little visitors, although there were occasions when some of our vegetables and fruit would go missing from our yards, but it was a small price to pay for the pleasure of enjoying the odd furry visitor. I lived in the local neighbourhood myself, in an apricot-coloured symmetrical designed house that possessed a green roof and green wooden windows and green shutters and a large wraparound porch. Our house was flanked at the back with a large area of natural forest that stretched back for many miles. Even though I had a sheriff's office in the local town, as a small town I was pretty much on duty all the time, even when I was off duty, so to speak, if you get my drift. People could literally call me day or night at any time or hour if they were experiencing any kind of trouble. But living in a small town where crime was very much unheard of, you would think that I found my job tediously boring, but not so. On the contrary, being a sheriff was much more exciting and colourful job than you could ever imagine, because I got to know some interesting, curious people in the community very well indeed. And believe me, we had some remarkable characters in our neck of the wood that brightened the dullest day. Of that I can assure you. And if I had all day, I would have some funny stories to reveal to you, but another time perhaps. One evening I was having dinner with my wife Anna and our daughter Isabella when I received a very urgent phone call from an elderly lady in our neighbourhood called Alice. At the best of times, Alice was a dramatic character that would always make a mountain out of a molehill out of the most ordinary situations. I'd been called out to her house when there was a big rat in her backyard and she was so terrified, and when there was a dead cat lying close to her driveway. She just couldn't cope with situations like that. So I pretty much expected that that was what this call was about. I could tell that she was in a dreadful state on the telephone, and to be honest, I'd never heard her sound this flustered or paranoid before. "Get here now," she cried. "I've never been so frightened in all my life." I remembered excusing myself from the dinner table and kissing my wife and daughter on the cheek and sighing to myself as I reluctantly got into the car. I was almost certain that Alice had just seen another rat in her kitchen and was having a panic attack about it, and invariably she was going to need me to kill it for her and remove it from her home. When I arrived at her house, she ushered me in very quickly, and she looked over her shoulder in concern, as if she was afraid of something or someone in her yard. "Everything all right, Alice?" I asked. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." "Shh," she said. "They might come back. They might come back." "Who might come back, Alice?" I asked. "The devil's children," she whispered. "The devil's children." "Sorry, Alice, you've lost me. What on earth are you talking about?" Alice's eyes were as wide as saucers, and she was physically shaking, and I realised I'd never ever seen her this distressed before. And I knew at once that something really insidious and quite awful had just transpired. "About 20 minutes ago," said Alice, stammering, "two menacing-looking children were knocking at my door. When I opened the door, the kids were standing there, telling me to let them in. But by the way they spoke, it was so mechanical, like a robot, but their eyes, they were just completely black, and I could feel this nefarious evil around them. I've never, ever sensed anything like that before. Immediately I slammed the door in their faces, and they continued to knock, and they kept saying, 'Let us in! Let us in!' I've never been that afraid in all my life. Sheriff, those children were not children, I promise you that. When I would not come to the door, they were literally screaming at the top of their lungs, 'Let us in! Let us in!' like that. And they were hammering my door with their fists so hard that the door actually shook under the vibration. But I'm glad to say they appear to have gone now. But supposing they come back, Sheriff," she said, looking at me with terror in her eyes. "I don't know what I will do if they come back, Sheriff." "I'm sure they won't be coming back, Alice," I said. "Maybe those kids were just trying to scare you, having a bit of fun. You know what kids are like." "Sheriff, those kids were not kids. They were the devil's children. They were not human." I didn't know what to make of Alice's peculiar story, as it seemed so incredibly far-fetched, but I did my very best to reassure her. Suddenly her phone rang, and after she answered it, she handed it to me. "I think it's for you. Someone else is having problems." I imagine my wife had informed the caller to call me at Alice's home, as in those days we didn't have the convenience of cell phones. "Hello, Sheriff. Is that you?" "Yes, it is," I answered. "Who is this?" "It's Jenny Jones from number 22. "Oh, hello, Jenny. What's up?" I asked. "You do sound rather alarmed. Is everything all right?" "Sheriff, something quite dreadful has happened. I don't know what to do," she cried out in distress. "What's wrong, Jenny? What's happened?" I asked. There were these horrible, horrible children knocking at my door, Sheriff. Quite the most ghastly children that I've ever had the misfortune to meet. There were 2 of them, a girl and a boy, of about 10 years old. And even the clothes they were wearing, Sheriff, they weren't typical of kids their own age. They were made of a very odd-looking material, and even a weird style and design. When I opened the door, they asked me to let them in because they said they were hungry. Sheriff, those kids were not kids, nor were they hungry. Their eye sockets were totally black. And Sheriff, when I say black, I mean the darkest, most black that you could ever imagine, as black as coal. And they had no irises in their eyes and absolutely no whites. Also, Sheriff, their soulless, monotonous voices sounded weird and automatic and machine-like. I could not let them in, Sheriff. I don't know where they came from, but they are incredibly demonical. You could sense it. It was that palpable. I couldn't let them in, Sheriff, as I said. I couldn't. I shut the door in their faces, and they are at my door right now, Sheriff, screaming like satanical banshees, ordering me to invite them in. Please get here now, Sheriff. Please, I beg you. I don't know what I'm going to do if you don't. I immediately left Alice's house and drove straight to Jenny Jones's, which wasn't far away. Then I saw them. I saw these 2 children hammering at the door, and their backs were turned away from me. But the way those kids were pounding that front door was not normal behaviour for a child. There's no way that a kid could lash out as violently and aggressively as these kids did, and their fists seemed almost too powerful for a child's fists, because they were hammering that door with such brute force. It would not be physically possible for a kid to hit that hard, I can assure you of that. I ran towards the door, and the malevolent kids turned around to stare at me. And I promise you, these unsavoury children were definitely not human. Alice was right about that. Nor were they children, even though they appeared to be. They were insidiously evil, and their odorous eyes were like large pools of black water, and when they stared at me, it put the fear of God into every fibre of my being, and I'm not exaggerating. I remember my hair stood on end, and my heart was literally pounding at 1,000 miles an hour. You tell me any kids can do that to you, because I don't know of any. I was terrified by these iniquitous children that were definitely not children. I'm certain of that. I told the children to get out and to go away, and that they were not welcome in our town. "Arrest us, Sheriff," said the boy. "Invite us in to your station." I knew at once that these kids wanted to be invited into our homes, even arrested. They wanted that invitation. I realised that if they were not invited, they would endeavour to manipulate us to invite them in, so I challenged them. I said, "Whatever or whoever you are not children, and no one in our town will invite you into their homes. You are diabolically evil, and you are concealing yourself in a childlike disguise that I don't buy for a minute, and you haven't fooled me, so get out of our town at once." Those 2 children looked startled and amazed by my words. Something shifted because the words I spoke were so powerful and efficacious, as if those kids were clearly wearing some kind of holographic disguise, which almost disintegrated before my very eyes, much to my amazement, almost melting away like chocolate. This fake hologram, which is what I think it was, started making a very curious buzzing sound, like a television that goes on the blink or loses connection. And I noticed their faces became blurred and fuzzy, but amidst this murky haze, I'm convinced I got a glimpse of a grey alien. But you always second-guess yourself, so I'm not quite sure if I'm right, and I could be mistaken by what I think I saw, because that's what it is, that's what I thought I saw. The kids began to run away from me as fast as they possibly could, because I think they didn't want me to see who they really were. And then they vanished and almost disappeared, and I've no idea where they went, but I didn't care as long as I never ever saw them again, because they were that diabolical. It was a very bizarre experience for me, one that I will never be able to make any sense of at all. Meeting those evil children was one experience of a lifetime that I cannot forget. and I think anyone else who had an encounter with them would feel that way too. I do know that the residents that encountered those duplicitous children suffered tremendous anxieties for years after the harrowing event. In the days that followed, there were incredible reports of strange anonymous lights seen floating over the forest area, and a strange buzzing sound like a loud generator was reported by many residents in the area, who described the sound as very mechanical and exceedingly unsettling, and the noise went on for about 45 long minutes. Even more extraordinary was that one of the locals found a large circular burnt-out area in a wooded clearing while he was out walking his dogs in the woods. It was quite literally a cookie-cutter size of a colossal flying saucer that was burnt out in the grass. It was all very peculiar, and nobody knew what to make of it. Was this connected to the black-eyed children? I don't know, but I do know that they want you to invite them in, and when you do that, I'm almost certain that something very nefarious and very awful will happen to you. As Alice so eloquently put it, those are the devil's children, and I wholeheartedly agree, because there is no other way to describe them. Are those black-eyed children connected to grey aliens? I believe they are, but I guess that subject is open for debate. One day I got a call from a frantic resident to tell us that her son Stephen had gone missing in the woods, and he had been playing with his brother Philip, and then he just vanished during their game, and Philip didn't know where on earth he'd gone. Philip was in a dreadful commotion because his brother had vanished before his very eyes, and his mother was hysterical. We set out with a large search party to look for Philip, but we couldn't find him anywhere for 3 long days, and he was registered as missing and presumed dead. 3 days later he suddenly appeared from absolutely nowhere, and he had an extraordinary story to account. I had no reason to doubt that at the time he begged me not to tell anyone his amazing story for fear of being disbelieved or ridiculed, and this was his account as he described it to me. My brother and I were playing in the woods using our slingshots. I quickly ran to a section of the woods to relieve myself, and I remember losing my balance, slipping and then somersaulting down this large hollow opening in the ground that was covered and concealed by dense overgrown shrubbery that you would never have known was there unless you'd actually seen it. It may have been part of an old mine shaft, I'm not sure. I must have hit my head really badly because it was throbbing violently and bleeding profusely. I do remember drifting in and out of consciousness. I also vaguely recall that Stephen was calling out for me, but I tried to answer him, and then I think I lost consciousness all over again, because everything after that went blank. I must have blacked out for a long while, how long I have no idea, but I do remember waking up and stirring very slowly and finding myself in this strange hollow, and everything was very foggy and blurry and confusing for me at the time. I was disorientated and very muddled. It was like I'd lost my short-term memory for a while. I couldn't understand how I'd got into this hollow, nor could I remember how I'd got here in the first place. I tried to climb out of this mine, but it was too deep for me to get out of it, so I was stuck there, and I kept calling out for help, but no one came to my rescue, and no one heard my desperate calls, and I screamed out for a very long time until I was completely hoarse and had almost lost my voice. I became very distraught and frightened because I was all alone in this dark shaft. My head was still hurting, but my memory did come flooding back finally, and I suddenly remembered my fall and how I'd ended up in this deep hollow in the first place. I felt hungry and thirsty and tired, and my dry mouth was parched because I was so thirsty. I was longing for a drink. I kept holding on to the vain hope that my family would come looking for me, so I called out again and again, but no one was answering my calls. I felt horribly alone and quite frightened, to be truthful. Suddenly I saw this humongous hand pull back the undergrowth like a curtain and tear it away. And then I saw this huge cone-shaped face peering down at me with an agog look on its hairless, leathery face. It looked shocked and surprised, but the face was so human, and yet it wasn't human at the same time. What on earth was this strange creature, I was wondering to myself, because it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had a very distinct brow ridge, a flat nose, a slender mouth, and a very deep-set, treacle-coloured pair of eyes that were actually quite warm and friendly, if I say so myself. I wanted to scream because for a moment I felt like a deer that was ensnared in a lion's den, and that this dangerous apex predator was staring at me as if I was a quick, easy, appetizing snack. But I did realize by the look that this clearly wasn't the case. The creature wasn't at all aggressive, but seemed amused to see me caught up in the old mine shaft, and if I didn't know any better, I could swear it was chuckling and laughing at me. I noticed the creature's eyes were incredibly warm, friendly and kind, without an ounce of animosity, so I immediately lost my fear and relaxed. I did try to ask the creature for help by explaining that I was stuck in this mine shaft. Suddenly the creature jumped down to the area where I was sitting, and he landed at the bottom of the shaft, literally with the agility of a domestic cat. He had no problems landing on the ground. I was fascinated and realized that the creature had heavily padded human-like feet with a slightly angled large toe, and the feet were very human but humongous. I noticed also that the creature was agile and graceful, although very colossal in size, much bigger than a black bear. I would say she was about 9 foot tall, 900 pounds and 4 foot wide, and she was covered with long flowing auburn hair that I remember thinking to myself was a particularly beautiful colour. I noticed her breasts were covered in hair, and her overlong arms hung well below her knees, so I imagined she could run very easily on all fours, as easily as on 2 feet. I also noticed that her physique was incredibly powerful, very impressive and strong, especially her colossal shoulders that were very gargantuan. The creature grabbed a huge stone, and with it she hammered into the side of the rocky miney shaft with such brute strength that she was able to make some large footholds in the wall. For a human to attempt to do that would have been very difficult, but for her it was with effortless ease. A human would have had to use a very powerful axe, or something probably electronic. As she made the footholds in the wall, she would perch on one foothold while effortlessly balancing her whole body on one foot, while she used the stone to make a series of footholds several feet apart until it reached the opening of the shaft. She picked me up in her arms and placed me over her shoulders as if I weighed absolutely nothing, and before I knew it I was lifted out of the shaft. How she did it I have no idea, but she was so quick and efficient. She then placed me on the ground and made a few chattering sounds, and then like grease lightning she disappeared into the forest, leaving me there. I could not believe that this creature had helped me like this. She was beautiful, majestic and lofty, and quite literally had saved my life, because I do not know if I would have ever been found in that mine shaft if she had not answered my frantic calls, so I'm so grateful that she did. After my experience with the black-eyed kids, I was not dismissive of this boy's claims, but I told him that he was never to tell anybody about what had happened, because I knew that there were people out there in our community who would not believe his story and would laugh at him, and I knew, even though I knew his story was true. One evening when I was called out to a family who swore they'd seen a dark shadow loitering around in their backyard, and they were afraid, and had heard a strange noise that they described as a series of whooping sounds. As I parked my car, I went straight to the family's backyard with my flashlight to see if I could investigate that black shadow they'd been talking about. Suddenly I heard this whooping sound, and then I saw the small 3-foot creature covered in auburn hair that looked absolutely terrified to see me, and it quickly ran away, shimmering up an oak tree in the yard, trying to hide. Suddenly I heard a very distinct whooping sound, and then the little creature was looking at me through the trees in a worrisome way, but then it decided to rush down the tree like a fireman on his pole, and it thundered past me at 1,000 miles an hour like a rhino, and it raced towards a tall figure covered in auburn hair that fitted the boy's description perfectly of the strange creature that had rescued him from the mine shaft. I think this could have been the one creature that had saved him. I got the impression that the little one had got lost and called out to his mother for help with those strange whooping sounds. The little hairy humanoid creature whimpered in delight to see his mother, and jumped on her back, and off they went. For a second she looked at me with her treacle-coloured eyes. I remember thinking, wow, you're magnificent, whatever you are, because the creature was majestic, lofty, powerful and beautiful, and when she moved she was so graceful and as fast as a cheetah. I was so in awe of her. "Did you see anything, Sheriff?" asked the resident in the house. "Did you see that black shadow?" "No," I lied. There's nothing in your yard. You're perfectly safe." All these years later, I reflect on the creature that I saw. And after all the publicity about Bigfoot, I was to learn what the creature was that I encountered all those years ago, and the creature that rescued the young boy from the mine shaft. I also learnt that I'm not alone in my strange experiences with those black-eyed children. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Nicholas and I'm initially from Detroit, and I had my Bigfoot encounter in 1983 when I was 32 years old at the time. I think I chose to become a truck driver because I've always been a rather reclusive person and never very good in social situations. I grew up as an only son to a single mother who was quite literally the most social person you could ever hope to meet. My mother had an exhaustive, enervating supply of energy, like a steam train on full throttle. She seemed to just run on a powerful turbocharged adrenaline supply. It was easy to become jaded and frazzled in her presence because she could never, ever sit still, not even for a moment to catch her breath. It was quite extraordinary. I always had a sneaky suspicion that her restless, highly strung behaviour and hyperactive mentality was what possibly caused my parents to split up before I was even born. Even though I never knew my father, I did have enormous empathy for him, because I gather he did try to make the relationship work. But believe me, I knew better than anyone else how difficult my mother could be to live with due to her rambunctious, unrelenting energy, which was utterly exhausting. I do remember if we were sitting at the waiting room at the dentist or something, for example, my mother would literally pace up and down the waiting room like an overzealous gerbil on a spinning wheel. The receptionist would tell my mother that she was welcome to sit down, but my mother just simply could not, because she was so hyped up, fidgety and excitable all the time. I would be sitting there pretending to read a magazine because my mother was such a huge embarrassment to me. The people in the waiting room would wear a "what the heck is wrong with that woman" sort of expression on their face. I think they thought she was high on drugs. So I would always distance myself from my mother, almost pretending that I did not know her. And I want to assure you, she never took a drug a day in her life. Why could she not sit down like a normal person, I would wonder to myself. Everywhere we went, it was a continuous rush. I recall times when my impetuous mother would quite literally race down the supermarket aisles, causing pandemonium, throwing things into her trolley, as if she was taking part in the Boston Marathon. Believe me, she got strange looks from people with her somewhat bizarre behaviour. I remember one bloke called out to my mother once, "What's the big hurry, woman? The world's not about to end. Slow down before you give yourself a heart attack." Another time a man shouted to my mother, "For goodness sake, woman, you scared the living daylights out of me, thundering through the store like a rhino on the charge. You made me think there was a gunman on the loose." My mother was an events organiser, and so naturally I was always dragged along to these social events, kicking and screaming, with hundreds of people, and these events were so tediously boring for me. And despite the partying, superficial banter and dancing, I rarely felt like a fish out of water, and very uncomfortable. All I ever wanted to do was to just run away and hide. I was like a shrinking violet at all these social events and gatherings, and I truly believe that the time I was amongst tons of people, I was at my very loneliest. Of course, on occasions like this, my mother was in her true element, because she loved the energy of these events. And I kid you not, she was always the last person on the dance floor, strutting her stuff like a peacock, and begging the exhausted DJ to keep playing his music a while longer, when everybody else had left the dance floor and even gone home. So now you get the picture why I chose to become a truck driver. I really have never minded my own company, and I quite enjoy being reclusive for a while. I'd liken myself to a reticent tortoise that only comes out of my shell on my own terms, when I am actually in the mood. Otherwise I'm very happy, nestled and tuckled away inside my shell, thank you very much. I have a lot of respect for tortoises taking life in their stride, and not always being in a tearing rush. There is much to be said about that. As you can imagine, being a truck driver was not a choice pleasing to my mother, as she was hoping that I would join forces with her in her events planning business. But believe me, that was never going to happen. One lady who worked with my mother once actually had a heart attack, and believes my mother's nervous energy facilitated it, and frankly that does not surprise me at all, if that in fact is the case, as horrible as it is to say. I really enjoyed trucking from day one, and it was so brilliant being out there on the open road and having a travelling companion with me called Zachriel, Zachy for short, that travels all around North America with me. I actually picked him up on one of my travels. I remember I stopped my truck once and pulled over to the side of the road because I'd noticed something moving next to the deceased body of a beautiful grey cat that had clearly been recently run over and subsequently thrown to the side of the road and discarded like a piece of trash. I knew that something was moving, so I was to discover the cutest fluffy tiny kitten, cradled into its mother's dead body, crying and bleating. I picked up the poor little thing and took him into my truck, raising it on a syringe of formula, with the full intention of taking it to a rescue shelter when I finally returned home. However, this clever little bundle of inspiration had other ideas, and this gorgeous kitten grew and somehow wormed his way into my heart, and there was no going back because I simply had to keep him. Zachy adores the open road and often sits on the dashboard watching the world go by. He's a very handsome blue-grey cat with a white bib on his chest and a very pronounced white moustache that makes him appear like a gentleman. When he sees something that excites him on the open road, he will release a long stream of happy purrs, and sometimes he'll sleep for hours on the passenger seat, often only rising from his sleeping position at the next stop to see where we actually are. I think he loves the fact that the truck stops at all these unusual parts of the world, and he is good about getting off my truck and relieving himself and swiftly returning, which I know is unusual behaviour for a cat, but not for Zachy. He's done that since he was a kitten. When I first started driving a truck for the first year or so, I tended to drive during the daylight hours because I was initiating myself to what it was like to be a truck driver. I would work for various truck companies, delivering shipments sometimes to regular clients. On one occasion, one of these clients, who ran a company with her husband, pulled me to one side for what she described would be a nice little chat. I remember she gave me a large sweet chocolate donut and a big cup of coffee to drink, which was the first time she'd ever shown me even remote hospitality. It was rather odd. She was a very flirtatious woman who always wore her skirts far too short and her tops far too low, and she would totter round the place in heels that were so high I actually thought she was in danger of breaking her neck, and I'm not kidding either. She had bottle blonde hair and the longest manicured nails I've ever seen in my life that were always painted in shocking pink colours, and I marvelled that she could get anything done with nails that long. "I have something very important to ask you," she said, "and it's worth $50,000 for you." $50,000 was nothing to be sneezed at, and so she got my attention. But so did one of her fake eyelashes that was dangling off her cheek like an insect that I wanted to squat away, but I wisely decided against it. "I need you to kill my husband for me," she said. "Think about it. No one would ever suspect you because you deliver freight to our premises very regularly. On one of these occasions, when you're dealing with my husband, you can shoot him in the head at point-blank range. No one would ever doubt you, and I'll make sure I'm not around on that day so the police won't suspect me either, and it'll simply appear to have been a random shooting. I'll make out that a substantial amount of money was robbed from the safe, and that will be the motive for the crime." I looked at the woman in absolute horror. Could she really be this cold-blooded and practical at the same time, and talk about murdering her husband as effortlessly as she would discuss the next nail-polish colour she wanted to buy? "You are joking, right?" I said. "You are pulling my leg." The woman looked at me intently. "I'm not joking," she said. "I'll give you $60,000 then if you do it. I'll give up another $10,000 now. I think I'm being more than generous." "Why do you want him dead?" I asked. "Is he beating you up or something?" "No, I have a sizable life insurance policy out on him," she laughed. "We're quite literally talking about a life-changing amount of money. It's nothing to be sneezed at, believe me. And you're also benefiting. Don't forget that in a month of Sundays." I looked at the woman aghast. "You want me to kill your husband just for money?" I asked. "That and the fact that my husband is miserable old bore, and I cannot stand the air he breathes, if that helps in any way." "Look," I said, "I wouldn't kill your husband if you paid me $1 million. I'm not that kind of person. I value life. I warn you," I scolded. "If I hear that anything untoward or suspicious has happened to your husband, I will be telling the police about this little conversation of ours. Do you understand? So forget any ideas of killing him, unless you want to spend the rest of your life rotting away in a women's prison. So do not think of doing anything silly like this. You'll live to regret it because, believe me, no money is worth losing your freedom over, and if you're not happy in your marriage, it's simple. Just get a divorce. It's not rocket science. The woman looked at me in absolute amazement. You mean you're turning down $60,000 just like that, she said, looking flummoxed. I really thought she'd be keen on this idea. You'd get a lot of money. Not a chance, I said, taking the signed invoices from the woman and getting back into my truck. She watched me drive away, but I wound down my window and said, Oh, by the way, your fake eyelash is on your cheek. And then I drove away, just like that. I remember getting into my truck, wondering if I should report her to the police, but decided against it because I was certain my warning was not enough to frighten her off doing anything quite so crazy. But it turns out I was wrong. But back to that story in a moment. One day I decided to start driving my truck at night because it had been a hellish brutal summer with unrelenting heat, and despite the air conditioning in my truck, I was getting fed up with driving in these tiring conditions, and so I decided to give nighttime driving my full attention, which is exactly what I invariably did. Driving at night was not without its setback, I promise you, as visibility is greatly reduced and services from dispatch are less reliable. However, I began enjoying driving at night because I could drive to my own destinations a lot quicker without the inevitable daytime hold-ups that swallow your time like whales with plankton. It was also cooler in the summer months, driving at night, which I tend to prefer. One night at about 4 a.m, to be precise, I saw this figure walking next to the guardrail. It was the statue of a svelte woman, dressed in what appeared to be 1800s clothes. I didn't know this at the time, but after I did research online, I discovered the dress fitted the 1800s time period almost perfectly. She appeared to be wearing this long flowing dark russet dress that fell above her ankles, and it appeared to have a very elegant high neckline and long sleeves. I remember thinking she was quite smartly attired, but what was she doing walking about at 4 o'clock in the morning? And being naturally protective towards women as I am, I pulled over to the side of the road to ensure that she was all right, because that's what a chivalrous gentleman would do. Lady, I said, it's not safe for you to be walking around this early in the morning when it's so dark outside. Can I drop you off to your home? For a moment the lady appeared to hesitate, and then reluctantly she stepped into the truck and sat reclined in the passenger seat next to me. I noticed she possessed a very graceful countenance, and her posture was impeccably straight. I also noticed that her appearance was rather unusual. It appeared that she had very long brown hair that had been braided on the sides, and she even had a braided bun and some deliberate areas of loose hair strands that fell back below her shoulders that were clearly part of the attractive hairstyle that looked like she would be something a bride would attempt on her wedding day, but not for an everyday occasion. So where am I taking you to? I asked. I'll show you the way, she said, indicating for me to drive straight ahead, which invariably I did. Do you mind me asking what you're doing outside so late at night? I asked. I'm looking for Muskie, she said, suddenly growing very alarmed. I cannot find Muskie anywhere. Sorry, you've got me, I said. Who is Muskie? Muskie, she said. Muskie is my little white dog. I cannot find him anywhere. What am I going to do? Suddenly the strange lady started to sob. I cannot find Muskie, she repeated. I've looked everywhere for him, she cried, sounding so distressed. Barker says he's run away from home and is never ever coming back. How could he say something so cruel and heartless? I grabbed a tissue for the woman and turned around to give it to her, but she was gone. Now remember, I'd been driving and had turned away for half a second, and in a flash of light the woman had just vanished. That wasn't even physically possible. It had happened far too quickly. For a long moment I could not fathom what could have happened to her, because the lady sitting next to me had been as vividly real as you and I are. And I mean physically real. It wasn't like she was half there, or ghost-like in any way. But there was no conceivable way for her to just jump out of my truck without me knowing about it. I realized in a moment of shocked revelation that this woman must have been a ghost. But how can something so physically real be a ghost? But what else could she have been? As I continued to drive a few yards down the road, I saw the strange woman walking on the side of the road all over again, and I was so rattled and freaked out. The anomalous woman turned around and waved at me with a warm smile on her face, and she was lifting up the little white poodle to show me that she had actually found little Muskie. I tell you, she freaked me out so much that I just hightailed it down that highway as fast as I could. I know she was a benign, friendly ghost, but the experience nevertheless freaked me out, and was something I have never been able to fathom or understand, because she had to be a ghost. Of that I am certain. I had never believed in ghosts before, but if they were real, which they clearly are, I never imagined that they would appear as physically real as you or I are. It does leave me to ponder how many of us may have encountered ghosts among us without even knowing that they're actually ghosts. On one occasion at 12:15 at night, I noticed that there was this large figure standing in the middle of the road, and I realised at once it was a woman in a long fur coat, appearing to be bent over and examining something in the road. So I immediately got out of the truck to see whether she was all right. Imagine my amazement when she looked up at me, and I realised she was not a woman at all, but a creature covered from top to toe in long flowing auburn hair. She was standing over a smaller creature who was clearly her youngling, who was covered in hair, and he had big padded foot, but a massive piece of glass was literally lodged in his foot, and he was whimpering in agonising pain. This larger creature was trying to remove the glass from the little one's padded foot, but whenever she touched the corner of the glass, the little creature would slap her and let out a warning dog-like growl, because I imagine it hurt terribly much. At that moment I forgot that those creatures weren't human. I don't know why, but I just did, and immediately sprang into action. Maybe it's because I did work on a stint with the ambulance service for a while, and I just knew how to react in adverse situations. I quickly rushed to my truck and brought out a large bag of ice and my medical supply kit, and I bounded towards the hairy creatures in the middle of the road, very, very confidently, not worrying at all about my safety, because I didn't even think about it. I immediately took charge of the situation, and for some extraordinary unexplained reason, the creature just permitted me to help them, which I'll never ever understand why. I placed the block of ice around the whole area of the wound in order to numb the area for a good 5 minutes, and then I put my hand on the glass and pulled it out in a second, and the youngling was so surprised because it hadn't felt any pain at all, and it let out such a happy little whoop as if to say, "Mummy, it didn't hurt!" The two creatures were amazed that I'd got out the piece of glass. The mother took the glass fragment from me in her hand to examine it with one of her large sausage-sized fingers. She appeared to be absolutely fascinated by the glass. I could see she was testing it for sharpness, as she wanted to study what had injured her youngling, and you could tell she was not pleased with the piece of glass that had harmed her baby like this. I disinfected the wound and wiped away any excess blood, and then layered a bandage around the little youngling's foot, which was different to a human foot in the way that the large toe did not align straight with the rest of the toes. The feet were human-like, but much more padded underneath, and much more like a cat's paws, really spongy and thick. When the bandage was on the youngling's foot, he became so excited, he kept admiring it like we would admire a brand new pair of shoes. He kept lifting his foot to the left and to the right to examine the bandage, and he was thrilled with his new accessory and thought it was the most wonderful, exciting thing to wear. He kept showing it off to his mother. The little jubilant creature got up and managed to walk, and he found that he could walk easily on his foot, which clearly astounded and delighted him, and once again he made an ecstatic whooping sound to express his appreciation. I was surprised to see Zack, my cat, sitting on the opposite side of the road, watching everything transpire with a curious interest, and then he started to groom himself, which showed me that he was perfectly comfortable in this creature's presence, which was in itself quite amazing. For a second the two creatures stood on the side of the road, chattering excitedly backwards and forwards in a monkey language, and then they glanced briefly at me and chatted backwards and forwards again. I knew they were discussing me, and they sounded very excited. I really got the impression that they perceived me much like you would perceive an angel that comes to your rescue, helping in a critical moment in time. They really were looking on me as an angel. The critters looked at me, nodded as if to say thank you, and glided off the guardrail down the embankment to the vast area of forest below. When they moved, I was in utter awe, because they appeared to float with a seamless grace. I was mind-blown by those creatures. What on earth were they, I wondered in amazement. I'd never seen or heard of a creature like this before. At a guess, I'd say the large creature was about 8 foot tall, 600 pounds and 4 foot wide, while the youngling must have been about 4 foot. As I said, they were covered with long auburn hair that reminded me of a red fox, although the hair was human-like in its texture. These creatures were very human-like in form, only much, much larger than a human, and infinitely more muscular, with huge shoulders and overlong arms. The head was shaped like a bullet, but the hairless, leathery, pinky-grey face was long, and they had very deep-set brown eyes, a prominent brow ridge, a flat nose, and a very slender mouth. I could not be sure if the taller creature was female, as I had never noticed her breasts, but I am pretty sure she was, because she possessed a very maternal feminine energy. It did not even occur to me to be frightened of these creatures, because they were so gentle and serene, and so human-like that it was absolutely natural to help them, as I would have helped a fellow human being in trouble. I remember I discovered a great deal of broken glass on the highway, scattered all over the road, so I decided to pick it all up, because it invariably was going to cause another animal to get very badly hurt, or potentially puncture someone's tyre. Fast forward 2 months, and I was delivering some freight to the client who had asked me to murder her husband for $60,000. I never liked going back to that place after my experience with that woman. I was delivering freight to her at about 7 at night, and it was a pretty routine procedure as the client signed all the relative forms, and I was well on my way. It must have been 2 hours later when I saw this woman's husband, the one she'd asked me to murder for her, sitting on my passenger seat, larger than life. The only way I can describe him is that he looked like a very large hologram, and a lot less clear and vivid than the 1800s ghost that I'd once encountered on the road. I knew at once he was dead. That was clear to me, and that I was seeing his ghost. He was on my passenger seat for a couple of minutes, and then he was gone. I wasn't too afraid, because I had seen a ghost before. I had tried to communicate with him, but he was gone in a flash of light. I believe he revealed himself to me because he wanted me to report his suspicious death to the police. Even though it hadn't been confirmed he was dead, I knew he had to be, because I'd seen his ghost. Fast forward a few weeks, and that client of mine was placed in prison for life. I had to testify in court that she had asked me to murder her husband. I gather she got the postal worker to murder her husband, and if it wasn't for my testimony in court, she would have received a huge insurance payout. I believe her husband could not rest until she received her just deserts, and rightly so. I was to learn in about 2007 that the creatures that I encountered on the road all those years ago were Bigfoots, and I realized I was very privileged indeed to have such a spectacular encounter. I assure you that these creatures are real, and they are majestic, powerful, lofty, and very human-like. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Sandra, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015, when I was about 28 years old. I was very fortunate because I grew up in New York in a very lucrative, extravagant and luxuriously opulent apartment, as my Portuguese parents are incredibly wealthy and affluent. I am an only child, so my father regarded me as his precious little princess, and I was always incredibly spoilt growing up and wanted for absolutely nothing. As far as my father was concerned, I could do nothing wrong. Growing up, my parents sent me to a very expensive boarding school, and then I finally qualified with a degree in fine arts. I ended up working for a company that designs designer scarves, and I was a significant part of the innovatory, ingenious design team. One day I was introduced to another creative, inventive designer who was leading our team with some sparkling new and exciting pioneering ideas. He was a handsome, personable, debonair young man called Sebastian, and people called him Seb for short. He had dark hair, warm olive skin, and lovely twinkling hazel eyes. From the moment I actually met him, there was an undeniable chemistry between the two of us, which soon developed into a serious romantic relationship. One day I took Seb home to meet my parents at our fancy, very sassy New York apartment. My father took me to one side. Seb seems like a nice man, but I am concerned he is rather emasculated and sissy for my liking. Naturally, I got very defensive and explained to my father that Seb was an aspiring fashion designer who was clearly in touch with his feminine side, and that there was nothing wrong with that. It goes with the territory for a male designer to be more sensitive and effeminate, But it doesn't make him any less a man, I assured my less than convinced father, who was not easily persuaded. I told him that Seb always noticed when I was wearing a different colour nail varnish or when I was wearing a brand new outfit, and I truly liked that about him. I'll never forget how alarmed my father looked when I told him that. In his strong Portuguese accent, he told me that it wasn't good to hear at all. I do not notice these things with your mother. He's a very strange man, very, very strange. You're just being old-fashioned, I told my dad. I promise you Seb will finally grow on you when you get to know him. He's very warm-hearted, I promise you. I could see my father was not convinced by my earnest divulgement. On the more positive side, my besotted mother thought the sun shone out of Seb's backside. She was constantly hitting on him shamelessly in front of my dad, who was clearly not very amused by these somewhat amorous, flirtatious shenanigans, as harmless and innocent as they may have appeared. I love the way you do your hair, Mrs. Richards, Seb would flirt. My mother would say, Oh, I insist you call me Nancy. None of this Mrs. Richards nonsense, you hear me? Oh, I go to the hairdresser up the road. He's awfully good. He does a great deal of hair for celebrities, you know, said my mother, playing with her hair with a girlish exuberance. Seb continued, The lipstick colour you are wearing, Nancy, he said, très, très jolie. It means very, very pretty in French. And the lipstick, Nancy, is not even half as fetching as you are, if I may be so bold as to say. I could see by my father's appalled expression that he wanted to throw up and vomit violently, listening to this deluge of unashamed, flirtatious banter coming from Seb's flattering, honeyed tongue that seemed to just flow like an undulating sea of rising charm and philandering that seemingly would not be tamed or subjugated. My mother was soaking all these compliments up like a ravenous, eager sponge, and her ego grew at a colossal rate that I swear I physically could see her chest puff up just like a penguin. It seemed that she even grew a few centimetres in height, because she quite literally swelled up with pride. I'm glad you like it, Seb, she giggled like a silly schoolgirl, blushing from the attention that she was receiving, and clearly basking in it. My lipstick colour is crimson peach from Dido. I was shocked to see Seb taking down the colour of the lipstick on a little piece of paper he took out of his jacket pocket and promptly replaced, which was odd to say the least. Why on earth would Seb do that, I pondered. I'd never wear such a bright lipstick myself. Always useful to know these details, he said, as my father raised a quizzical eyebrow, as if to say, I've seen everything now. I kicked Seb violently under the table when my parents went into the kitchen to get the cheese board, the pudding, and the dessert wine. What on earth is wrong with you? I whispered. You keep flirting outrageously with my mother. It's not appropriate behaviour, and it's certainly not impressing my dad either. He doesn't like it one bit, because it's very disrespectful and impertinent. Your mother is a very beautiful woman, just like her daughter, he said, leaning over to kiss me on the forehead. I can see where you get your good looks from, and it's certainly not your father. I became outraged and defensive towards my dad. I'll have you know that my father is a very good-looking man, I snapped angrily. As my father entered the dining room carrying the cheese board, Seb was chuckling loudly. What's this thing you are laughing about? Asked my father curiously. I always enjoy a good joke. Your daughter seems to think you're very good-looking, Seb teased. It's amazing how blind daughters can be when it comes to their dads. You are grey at the gills, with a little overhang around the waist, and she fails to see any of that because she adores you so much. It's quite charming, really. Wow, Seb, I said. That's disgusting. Don't you dare talk to my dad like that. My dad is my world, and he's a very, very good-looking man, I insisted. It's all right, sweetheart, laughed my father. You don't need to defend my honour or my sagging waistline. I've had greater insults than that before. I think I can handle myself among the piranhas. You would think that after that nasty altercation at dinner, I would choose to never see Seb again. But somehow he managed to neutralise the damage that he'd done and use his charming, titillating tongue to woo me back into his life. I fell for his seductive charm, hook, line and sinker, probably even more pathetically than my mother had done. So you've guessed it, we finally did get married, and no expense was spared on my wedding day that was held at one of New York's most stylish, resplendent hotels, which was palatial and glitzy enough to meet with my mother's fastidious approval. I know my father never warmed to Seb, but my mother was over the moon to have what she described as the most dashing, handsome, and ever so sassy son-in-law. My father looked at me and said, "You know, little princess, I've never liked Seb very much. You're far too good for him, but as long as you're happy, that's all that matters to me. Remember, if this man ever upsets you in any way, I'm always here for you. I have a lovely present for you, and I've put it all in your name, and it has to stay that way, legally. Do you understand that?" I nodded. He was wiggling an enticing handful of keys in his hands, which he handed to me. "I hope you like it, sweetheart," he said. "It's an exquisite place in Oregon, especially for you, just like you always dreamed." I hugged my father tightly, tears pouring down my face in delight. I'd always wanted a place of my own in the country. "Oh, Dad, thank you so much." "It's only a pleasure, sweetheart," he said, kissing me on the cheeks. "You're always my precious little princess forever. You deserve the best." My dad had brought me an exquisite, stylish home in the Oregon countryside, on 500 acres of land, I kid you not, and I was champing at the bit to see it. My father knew I dreamed of living in the countryside, and in my line of business it was possible for me to prepare some of my designs from home, so it really was a win-win situation for all concerned. Even Seb was delighted with the prospect of breathing in some fresh country air and observing some indigenous wildlife in our own backyard. After our honeymoon, Seb and I moved into our beguiling, enchanting country abode, which was stunningly traditional-styled whitewashed farmhouse with a green roof that had been modernised, but at the same time possessed that rustic rural charm that you expect to find in a country dwelling. The house was so very spacious and airy, with large white wooden French windows that overlooked the ravishing Oregon countryside. It also possessed a large wraparound porch that was framed with a very quaint white lattice woodwork frame. The house was quite literally surrounded by mountainous valleys, pretty pastures, a magnificent silvery lake, and vast areas of natural forest that had been well maintained by the previous owners, who had used the property for hunting purposes. As you can imagine, there was a wide range of wildlife on our land, and it was not uncommon to see deer scampering around the place, and they were such gentle, serene little creatures to watch, and I loved it. I was so enchanted with my beautiful new abode, and I sometimes had to pinch myself every single morning because I couldn't believe this incredible abode was actually all mine. I truly had the most generous, loving father in the entire world, and I knew how privileged and lucky I was to be so blessed. It was fortunate that we were not too far from the nearby town, and so it was great to go shopping on a regular basis, but a few things happened with my husband that did have me feeling a little bit bewildered, to say the very least. One day I was having coffee with an old school friend of mine that I'd reconnected with when I bumped into her quite by chance at the supermarket in Oregon. She'd never met Seb before. It just so happened that the coffee shop in this large department store was where we were hanging out, and it overlooked the lingerie section of the shop. My friend looked at me and giggled. "Look at the creep over there. Look what he's doing with the women's lingerie. What a complete weirdo." Imagine my horror when I realised it was actually Seb who appeared to be examining the woman's lingerie with little too much enthusiasm for my liking, and he appeared to have a very rather jubilant expression on his face, which wasn't normal. Usually men always looked awkward and uncomfortable in lingerie shops when buying gifts for their wives or girlfriends, but Seb looked so comfortable and at ease, it was extremely disconcerting. Then he did something that actually made me physically cringe and want to vomit. I watched in horror as Seb actually tried on a bright purple lacy bra over his shirt and was examining himself in the mirror. He was looking to the left and to the right, to the back and the front. I think he didn't think anybody could actually see him doing this, because he kept looking around furtively to see if anybody was coming, obviously unaware that he had been seen by several pairs of astounded eyes. I could see the flustered, somewhat dismayed shopping assistant coming up to him, shaking her head rigorously, looking less than pleased with Seb. I saw that she was insisting he remove the bra, and judging by her expression, she wasn't at all impressed. I also noticed another lady innocently looking through the racks of underwear, who, in horror when she saw my husband parading around in a purple bra, threw down her lingerie that she intended to buy, and literally ran out of the shop, possibly because she was so unsettled by what she'd just witnessed. Who could have blamed her? I mean, it's not normal to see a man trying on a bra at the best of times, least of all in a department store of all places. It just doesn't get more weird than that. "Who does that?" whispered my friend in horror. "I mean, what man goes into an underwear shop and tries on some lingerie? He's got to be sick. That man's not right in the head. He belongs in a funny farm." "Maybe he's trying it on for his wife," I said, clawing desperately for a reason to excuse Seb's strange behaviour. I was utterly floored. I couldn't believe Seb was behaving in such a bizarre, atrocious way. But I told myself he was just looking for lingerie as a present for me, and was trying stuff on for size. It's amazing how much you will actually lie to yourself when you see something that you refuse to believe is actually true. I never even asked Seb on what on earth he was doing trying on that purple bra. As I saw, he did have a little bag in his hands, and I suspected he'd brought the lingerie for me as a surprise gift, so I felt momentarily relieved. Another time when something about my husband had me floored was when we went over to a friend's house. It appeared that she was having problems with her washing machine flooding, so my husband was bending over in the toolbox when I noticed with alarm that he was wearing a pair of bright pink knickers that were sticking out of his trousers. When the neighbour saw this, she started to giggle. When Seb realised she had seen the pink knickers, he made a huge joke out of things and said he'd been wearing the knickers on purpose to shock me as a joke. And silly me, I actually believed him and put it all down to a wacky, misplaced sense of humour. One day Seb informed me that he was building himself a solo hunting retreat in the woods and had organised a building team to come in and begin the project. In truth, I did not give it much attention because at the time I knew nothing at all about hunting and had so little interest in such pursuits. I'm afraid I didn't ask him many questions because at the time I was fully engaged in focusing on some new up-and-coming designs for our winter range of scarves, and I was bursting with fabulously innovative ideas. Over the next few months, Seb would frequent the woods very regularly with his rifle, telling me that he intended to do a little solo hunting, but he never ever returned with even a squirrel pelt, which I thought was exceedingly odd. I was also surprised that he had not grown weary or discouraged about hunting, because he spent copious amount of time in the woods, seemingly with no successful outcomes. I doubt if the shoe was on the other foot, I would be happy to engage in a sport without any beneficial reward. It was clearly apparent to me that Seb was a useless hunter. I guess the penny hadn't dropped with him yet, because he never gave up the sport, and appeared to pursue it with a relentless, insatiable passion that appeared to show very little signs of dissipating. One day when I had plenty of free time on my hands to laze around the house, I decided to take a look at the little hunting retreat Seb had built in the woods. At that time, Seb was actually in New York, discussing some of the latest scarf designs the company was creating, and he would also be introducing and presenting some of my new creations to the team. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that Seb had actually built a small little house in the middle of the woods, which appeared to have a long flat roof. It had been locked up, but I looked through the windows and saw wardrobes, carpets, chairs, mirrors, and even a large double bed there, not to mention a small kitchenette. I was absolutely stunned. I suddenly became furiously angry, because Seb had never included me in this strange building project, and it didn't look at all like a hunter's retreat. Why had Seb not told me that he was actually building a little house? Why all this secrecy? Was this where he had been spending all his time behind my back? All kinds of alarming thoughts entered my mind. I knew that Seb was up to something dubious, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. Perhaps this hunting malarkey was a bogus cover-up for something decidedly insidious and duplicitous. I was certain something untoward was going on, and I could feel it in my gut. As I was standing there in the woods, observing the long bungalow with its relatively low flat roof, I suddenly noticed that I could smell a really odd odour. It smelt rather like dirty trainers and a wet dog rolled into one, and I didn't know where the smell was coming from, but I promise you this, it was nasty. It was then that I heard a snoring sound that sounded like something or someone was fast asleep, and to my horror I realised that the sound was coming from the top of the flat roof. Something was clearly there fast asleep. There was a large oak tree that possessed a very sturdy tree branch that crisscrossed over the rooftop. It was relatively easy tree to climb, and so I scrambled up the tree as quietly as I could to have a good look at what was on the roof that was making this curious sound. I guess I was too inquisitive and intrigued to subdue my impulsive, spontaneous urges to see what this thing actually was. I slowly manoeuvred my body over the tree branch, prostrating and levelling myself like a surfboard, and then I peered over the rooftop. I quite literally was awestruck and bedazzled. I simply could not believe what I was actually seeing. I noticed that the roof was covered with all this soft grass, and lying on this nest was a strange-looking creature that on first impression looked exactly like a bear. But then I realised that this was no bear. But whatever this thing was, it was colossal and covered with long golden blonde hair, and this strange creature was snoring very loudly, but I could not see it clearly enough because its back was turned away from me. But I could see the hands, and that's what made me realise it wasn't a bear. I couldn't understand why the creature was using the rooftop as a sleeping den, because it definitely was cool up there, and it was very sheltered under the oak tree, and was an idyllic spot to sleep. I tried to get a better look at the creature, and in my somewhat futile, clumsy attempts to reposition my body into a closer position to the strange, anomalous beast, I suddenly precariously lost my balance on the branch and went tumbling and falling to the ground with a mighty thud, landing on a huge pile of golden leaves that provided me with a little cushioning on the soft ground. Below, I let out an agonizing, startled yelp, because I could feel this throbbing, shooting pain coming from my ankle, but I examined it and was glad to see it wasn't broken, but it was obviously sprained, and it did hurt a great deal. Suddenly I got the sense that I was being watched, and leaning across the roof was this huge cone-shaped head with a long human-like face that was staring down at me with deep-set brown eyes that looked both curious and concerned. It was as if the creature was saying, "Are you all right?" It must have been suddenly awakened by the commotion I had caused falling out of the tree. You know when there are moments in your life that may have transpired in only seconds, and yet that moment is positively one of the most memorable, extraordinary, special experiences of your life that is held in time for an eternity and can never be forgotten. Well, this was one of those stirring, magical moments for me. It was as if the entire world had all but stopped, and I had locked eyes with this incredible, majestic, powerful, and utterly beautiful beast. This creature possessed the loveliest golden brown eyes that I have ever seen, and I sensed that the eyes were amused by me, but were warm, congenial, and friendly. I knew at once that this creature was feminine, because her energy was female, and very, very maternal. I just remember our eyes locked as we just stared at each other for a while, and I sensed that we connected on a very deep spiritual level, and I know that sounds strange, but it really felt like that. As she rose up to stand up on the roof, she stretched her body up just like a pussycat does once it's risen from its sleep. The creature lifted its overlong arms and stretched them up towards the sky, and then she grunted. She then jumped straight off the roof, which was a good 10-foot drop, and landed perfectly on her padded human-like feet, exactly like a domestic cat, with the same amount of agility, dexterity, and grace. The creature landed yards away from me, and I think my mouth must have been hanging open like a Venus flytrap, and my eyes were possibly as round as saucers, because I was utterly amazed at how colossal she actually was at close inspection. I promise you, this creature could easily have dwarfed a black bear without any problems. I would say she was 9 foot tall, 900 pounds, and easily 4.5 foot wide. Another extraordinary thing about this creature was that she had the body of a supreme athlete, because her body was so brawny, muscular, and sinewy, especially the torso area, which possessed the very impressive, large shoulders. The creature's head was shaped like a cone, but she had such a beautiful face. It was angular, with a brow ridge and nose, with a pink leathery skin, but it was her deep-set eyes that blew me away, because they were incredibly beautiful. She stood there looking at me, and made a chattering sound while she was pointing to my ankle. I think she worked out that I had hurt it. She lifted her own huge foot off the ground and started to rub it. I think she was showing me that I should massage my sprained ankle, so I copied her movements, and it did immediately provide me with relief. I noticed that she stayed a couple of feet away from me, but she reached out to help me. I really could sense that. She then indicated for me to get up and try walking on my injured foot, which I did, and then she made a happy whooping sound as if to say, "Look, you can do it, you're fine." She then pointed towards the woods and let out a whistle, and I could hear her whistle being answered from further away. She then indicated that she needed to go, and I watched her bound away through the forest with the speed of a cheetah and the grace of a gazelle. When I got back to the house, I was so excited because it suddenly occurred to me that I had encountered a Bigfoot on my land. You would think I'd want to tell everybody in the world about my incredulous encounter, but I assure you that was not how I reacted at all. It was my big secret, and I was never ever going to tell a soul about it because it was such a personal, intimate and special moment for me. Fast forward a week or so, and I hadn't mentioned anything to Seb about his hunting retreat in the woods. I decided against it because I wanted to spy on him when he went on one of his bogus so-called hunts, and that's exactly what I invariably did. I remember the day so clearly and so vividly, as if it was yesterday. I approached the woods, and I could see the bright red wooden door to the bungalow was wide open, and so I slipped in and hid behind a curtain in the living area. I could hear someone playing jazz music in the background, and I remember hiding for 15 long minutes until a woman suddenly appeared in the living room and was adjusting her outfit in the long mirror, admiring herself. I suddenly realized that this was no woman at all, but Seb dressed up to look like a woman. He did look ridiculous, with a little bit of a spiky beard and a bright pink lipstick. It's not a good look. I came out of my hiding spot and confronted him. He was wearing a woman's dress and cardigan with a long flowing blonde wig, and he was adorned in my mother's favourite lipstick colour. He also wore black eyeliner on the eyes with a bright green eyeshadow, and on his cheeks he wore a red rouge. He was wearing luxurious silk woman's lingerie under his outfit, and his huge feet were stuffed in a pair of stiletto shoes that looked absolutely ridiculous. I do not wish to be unkind, but he looked exactly like a clown. I almost felt sorry for him because he looked like a deer caught in headlights. He was incredibly embarrassed for me to see him dressed up as a woman. I knew he must be feeling exposed and vulnerable, and I surprised myself by not getting too angry or overreactive. "Why?" I asked him. "Why are you doing this?" "I'm not interested in men, if that's what you think," he told me. "I really do love you. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. I thought if I told you that you would leave me. You should have told me all this before we got married. I deserve to know the truth," I said. "I know I'm sorry," he said, hanging his head in shame. "I just didn't want to lose you." "Why do you do this?" I asked. "You do realise that you look absolutely ridiculous." "I just love wearing women's clothes. It gives me this buzz pretending to be a woman." He then proceeded to show me his collections of bras, shoes, suspenders, stockings, wigs, makeup and handbags. He had spent copious amounts of money on women's clothes that far exceeded my own clothes budget, which was rather alarming to say the very least. I could see he was so excited introducing me to his feminine wardrobe. I was trying to understand, but I really felt sick to my stomach, because this was too much for me to handle. I knew that I could never ever feel quite the same way about Seb again. It was like a flash of bright light that I had suddenly seen all his warts and imperfections, and I just could not accept this dark side to his life. "This does not change anything between us, does it?" asked Seb. "I'm afraid it changes absolutely everything," I told him. Realizing my husband was a transvestite was hard to live with, and I just couldn't accept it, so I filed for divorce, although I have remained firm friends with Seb since then, and I still work with him at our company designing scarves, but we are no longer together. When I told my father about Seb being a transvestite, he was not surprised at all, but my mother was mortified. I don't think she has ever come to terms with that revelation. I have researched women online who have accepted their husband's transvestite behaviours, and I wish I could be so gracious, but I cannot, because my attraction to Seb just evaporated in a second, and I cannot live a lie by remaining married to someone I no longer love. As for the Bigfoot, I've often gifted her with food on the roof, because she still uses my ex-husband's roof like a large sun lounger under the oak tree, and she loves it there. It's also very cool in the summer months, and warm in the winter. I'm glad it doesn't bother her that I know her daytime hideout. I notice she adores grapes, salted potato chips, and sliced watermelon. Those are her absolute favourite treats. Sometimes she leaves me presents like animal pelts, berries, stones and antlers, which she leaves on my front door. I always know they're from her, and I treasure every single gift. I have seen her from time to time on my land, and she always acknowledges me, but I like to give her space because Bigfoots do not like being hounded by humans, and they like to keep themselves to themselves, and I know she's quite elusive. I never believed I would ever tell anyone about my amazing encounter, but I just want people to know that not all Bigfoots are aggressive or violent, and they are most certainly not a fabricated creature of fiction. I have called our Bigfoot Sunflower because she's such a brightful, cheerful soul. In July last year, I got remarried to my husband Carl, who's about as rugged and as outdoorsy as you can get, and he's the kind of man that could not go near a lingerie shop, even if you begged him to do so, and that's the way I like it. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Anastasia, but you can call me Anne for short, as indeed most people do. My Bigfoot encounter happened in the 80s when I was about 16 years old. I grew up in a small rural town, and the whole valley where we lived was exquisitely beautiful because there were so many acres of unblemished, untouched countryside, not to mention acres upon acres of untimbered woods that literally stretched back for thousands of miles. The streets where I lived were very colourful because the Mediterranean and Italian-style houses were painted in bright, cheerful colours that would be reminiscent of the bold, flamboyant colour schemes you see in Morocco today. If you've ever been to Marrakesh or somewhere like that, you would know exactly what I mean. Our enchanting little house was painted in a very bright, bold, sunflower yellow colour, with electric blue sash windows and a large blue front door with an eagle-shaped golden knocker. Our front yard possessed a quintessential white wicker fence with a little paved pathway that led to our front door. We had a very pretty terrace garden that my father maintained to perfection by keeping our front yard meticulously mown, and the flower beds were bursting with blue, yellow and white seasonal flowers to match the colour scheme of our home. It was such a stunning, eye-catching home because the blue and yellow colour scheme was so complementary, and it rarely worked. Most of the standard houses in our area all had swimming pools and porches with a barbecue area for entertainment purposes, and our spacious backyards overlooked the most spectacular mountainous views over purple-blue statuesque mountains that rose up in the blue-grey firmament like vast, rugged, majestic pyramids. On the end of our street was a cul-de-sac that ended with a very large cemetery with a typical, quintessential, imposing, somewhat menacing dark wrought iron gates, so reminiscent of the standard cemetery entrances you so often see in those typical horror movies. The pretty little poetic, rather enchanting cemetery was nestled in between picturesque hilly embankments which stretched back over a large area and was flanked on the back part with an area of natural woods that I think was publicly owned property, but the mature trees there, such as the oaks, maples, spruces and cedars, were tall and majestic, and the area was teeming with an abundance of natural wildlife. Sometimes in the evening you could see deer scampering through the graveyards and eating the rambunctious grass that grew up against the gravestones aggressively, and the deers did a better job than the gardener in keeping the grass at the cemetery so short and neat. I really do believe that I never ever saw the cemetery lawns actually being mowed because of the little white-tailed helpers that they had. The 80s was a great time to be alive because life was very easygoing and relaxed, and there was little crime in our part of the world, but people invariably never worried about locking their front doors. Even my own parents were not bothered about our comings and goings, so we were pretty much free to do as we pleased without them raising a quizzical eyebrow or asking any awkward questions. Believe me, that barely ever happened. My family lived next door to a likeable, rather distinguished-looking man called Andre Markham, and he was initially from Wimbledon in London, but he had got divorced and was living with his new glamorous American wife in our very small town. He had a young, free-spirited daughter from England who had just moved in with him, and she was my age, but she appeared to dress like a goth. I was fascinated the moment I met her, though, because she wore black lipstick and elegant black clothes, and even her hair was dyed black. Her name was Olivia, and she just stood out in our small town like a breath of fresh air, because everything about her was so alluringly different, and her peculiar but glamorous strange appearance would make her clearly distinguishable in any crowd. Yet once you became acquainted with her, you would begin to realize that she was no different to any other 16-year-old girl her age, and that we had much more in common than I ever imagined possible. The first time I was introduced to the prodigious, unconventional Olivia, I was shocked because I'd never met anyone as quirky and eccentric as her before. She was wearing a bohemian long black dress with a buttoned bodice and lacy sleeves. A pretty embroidered black shawl was draped over her petite shoulders, and her white hands were adorned with a pair of black lacy gloves. A large silk black rose was propped up in her long raven black hair. I noticed that on her angular face she had plenty of black eyeliner, copious amounts of mascara that was highlighting her beautiful blue eyes, and she had the fairest, most flawless whiter-than-white skin that I'd ever seen. She also had painted a beauty spot on the side of her cheek that in a strange way looked oddly endearing and attractive. Initially the girls in our small town were a little apprehensive about befriending Olivia, as there were whispers going around that she was possibly a witch or even a Satanist, due to the peculiar way she was attired. The implications of this brutal prejudice meant that for a long time poor Olivia was very much a loner. The kids in our town whispered, derided and smirked at her behind her back, and sometimes even unashamedly smiled contemptuously at her with coy looks on their faces. The extraordinary thing about Olivia is that her friendly, warm, engaging demeanour melted our ice-cold, disparaging, pernickety hearts. Not once did she even bat an eyelid when we smirked, belittled, or even made fun of her. Nor did she try and change herself to fit our shallow perception of what a 16-year-old girl should look or behave like. I think it was her faultless fearlessness to be uniquely individual without caring what others thought of her that clearly made us secretly admire her, wishing with all our hearts that we could be as confident, posed, and assertive as she invariably was. I was the first one in our town to actually invite Olivia over for a barbecue, and when I got to know her, I realized that she was an amazing, incredibly special person, and the way she dressed never ever bothered me again. Olivia was an avant-garde trendsetter and a natural leader, and not a compliant, duteous follower, and very soon she was the most popular, influential teenager in our town, loved by absolutely everyone. What I would actually call a mover and shaker, so to speak. One day she suggested we hung around in the cemetery because it was a local spot in our neighbourhood that was in close access and walking distance from our home, with the obvious clear advantages of not having parents eavesdropping on our conversations. Then, of course, there were those prudent kids in our group who surreptitiously enjoyed a good smoke or a tot of vodka behind their parents' back. We all realised that hanging out at the cemetery did seem like such a bad idea after all. I was not keen on loitering around a cemetery with a bunch of dead people. It did not sit well with me for a while, and I wondered if it was disrespectful to the dead. I was not sure of the ethical protocol of hanging around graveyards for social interaction and fun, but my friends persuaded me that I was being oversensitive and far too impressionable. "Are you afraid of ghosts?" Olivia teased. "No," I snapped defensively. "I'm just not sure hanging out in a cemetery is the wisest thing for us to do." "It'll be fine," insisted my friends. "What is the harm with it?" Very soon the cemetery became a regular hotspot and frequent hangout for our girly conversations, and before long I became as comfortable with the tombstones as I was indeed with the white leather sofa in my own bedroom. We usually visited the cemetery in the evenings between 7 or 8 in the evening, and at midnight in the weekends. Our parents rarely ever protested, although in truth they thought we were hanging around the local area, as none of us revealed we were spending time at the cemetery. That was way too much information to offload to our parents. I began to find the cemetery a beguiling and fascinating spot. I literally loved reading the names on the tombstones, and when the person had actually died. Some of the unkept, dishevelled graves were so weathered and worn and eroded by time you could not even read the name on the stone anymore, which really was rather sad. Many of the gravestones were of people who had died in the 1800s and even before then. I found it all incredibly intriguing, as did all my friends. So maybe some of the dead people were being remembered in a funny kind of way, so to speak, as we would ponder and examine the graves with a curious interest. One Saturday night we arrived at the cemetery at 5 minutes after midnight. It was a beautiful, exquisite night, and the dusky firmament danced with the bright twinkling stars, and the full ivory white moon provided excellent visibility. We were to discover that someone had actually recently been buried. This was not an unusual sight for us at all, as we had observed many fresh dug graves before. But we did always wonder how the person had met their end. We noticed there was a freshly dug burial mound covered with very generous bouquet of flowers, and there was no gravestone in sight, which wasn't uncommon either, because I imagine they had only just buried their loved one, and the gravestone was being made to order. Suddenly we heard this rustling sound, and could detect footsteps walking towards us. and we realised that someone was coming towards the burial site, probably to pay their respects to their loved one. "Hide," I whispered. "Someone is coming." Why I did this I don't know, because it's normal to expect visitors at the cemetery, but this was indeed unusually late. Immediately we all obediently went and hid behind a very expansive modern tombstone that could easily conceal all 5 of us girls. Initially we thought it was someone coming to talk to their loved one, as I said, and I could hear that it was a man and a woman standing over the recently filled-in grave, which may have only been buried earlier in the day. "Check to see no one's coming," said the man in a husky voice, using his trowel to remove the loose compacted soil of the grave. "There's no one here," came the woman's voice. "Start digging now," she said, looking around furtively. "I never thought it would come to this," said the man's voice. "Silly old codger, thinking Mum should be buried adorned in all her expensive jewels. Crazy old man." We watched in horror as the man began to dig away the earth with his trowel, and he worked very hard and efficiently to reopen the gravesite. "Anyone coming?" he asked the woman, whom I imagined was his wife. "It's all clear," she said. "Keep digging." I wouldn't be surprised if the old codger digs her up to check if she's still wearing her jewellery collection. I'd never put anything past that crazy, foolish old man. He's as mad as a hatter, I heard the man say. Her jewellery collection is worth a fortune. "Keep digging," said the woman. "Talking will slow you down. Hurry. Come on, get on with it." Suddenly there was an owl hooting, and the man looked up in alarm. "What's that?" he said. "Frank, no one's coming," the woman assured him. "It's only an owl hooting. Go on, keep digging." My friend started to giggle. "He's digging up his mother's grave for the jewels she's wearing." "I told you cemeteries are interesting places," said Olivia. "Weird things happen here. This is amazing. I can't believe we're actually witnessing this." "Shh," I whispered. "We don't want them to hear us." Finally the man succeeded in reopening the grave site, and we watched him jump in, and he climbed in to open the grave, and we heard him shuffling around in the open coffin. "Whew," he said. "She already stinks. The decomposing malarkey is not funny. Poor Mum, she looks so withered. This dead body business has got to be the worst job in the world. There's already maggots eating and crawling around her flesh. Awful, ugly things they are." "You've got to be kidding," said the woman. "Maggots already? Under the ground? Eating your mother's flesh?" "Hundreds of the bloody things," he said. "It's not pretty, let me tell you." "It could have been worse if we'd left it later," said the lady. "I don't need to think about that," said the man. "It's horrific enough in here with these crawling maggots. Remind me never to be buried." "Pass me the jewel," came the voice. "Quick, hurry. Pass the jewels." "Everything is here," said the voice. "The old miserable codger buried her with the entire diamond collection. What a hell of a waste. I mean, who does that? These are family heirlooms. My mother would have been ticked off with Dad for doing this. She would have wanted her great-grandchildren to inherit her jewellery. Dad didn't want anyone to have a thing. The mean old slippery sod. He does not want the family to get anything, especially me. Always been a miser." "Your miserable old dad is not normal in the head," said the woman. "Now come on, we need to get out of here before someone sees us or gets suspicious." We watched in amazement as diamond necklaces, bracelets and pearls that must have been worth an absolute fortune were being handed to the woman, who surreptitiously tucked them away in a little bag. "We've got them all, I think," she said. "You need to make it look the way the gravedigger left it, or your dad will be very suspicious," came the woman's voice. "I'm sure he'll be up bright and early with the larks to visit the grave and check that no one has been vandalising it. You know what he's like. We can't let him suspect a thing." Once the couple had gone, we all could not believe what we had actually just seen. It was clearly apparent that this dead woman had been buried by her husband with her vast collection of diamond jewels, and the son had come back in the middle of the night to retrieve them, hoping that his elderly father would never ever find out. "Well, I suppose," said Olivia, "it's a bit of a waste leaving diamonds to rot under the ground with a corpse. It's strange that he wanted all her jewels buried with her. I mean, those things are very precious, and I'm sure the mother would have wanted the family to inherit the jewels, but to dig the grave up to get them, isn't that a bit sacrilege? I don't know what to think. It's all a bit bizarre." "The son did the right thing," said Kate. "I mean, what a waste being buried with all that expensive family diamond that the grandchildren can one day inherit." So that was our first strange experience in the cemetery, and one that indeed convinced us that cemeteries were very cool places to hang out with. The second bizarre experience that happened in the graveyard was when we were sitting around a gravestone and two of the girls were smoking. Suddenly Kate looked very startled. She sat up, looking around anxiously. "Who touched me?" she said. "No one did," I said. "I distinctly felt someone touch me," she explained. In truth, none of us believed her, until one of us experienced our hair being tugged, and another person was physically pinched. We began to freak out. We kept hearing the strange chuckling sound, as if something or someone was finding our reactions terribly amusing. What creeped me out was this was happening without us observing the mysterious, elusive perpetrator, who surreptitiously managed to remain superbly inconspicuous. Naturally, when you're in a graveyard like this, it did make me aware of the paranormal potential that everyone else appeared to have overlooked. Could some ghostly apparition be playing games with us? I pondered to myself secretly. Every time we turned our backs, something strange would happen. Suddenly in horror we found ourselves being pelted with an avalanche of acorns that pounded us like a tornado of hailstorms. Once again we heard the amused chuckling sound, as clearly someone was finding our startled reactions extremely amusing and hysterically funny. We kept turning around to look for the culprit, but there was absolutely no one there. "I think I know who it is," said Olivia. "I think it's my stepbrother Hank, because this childish, pathetic behaviour is so typical of him," she said. "He followed us here and is pranking us, I know he is. Recently he's been putting salt in my tea and plastic snakes in my bed, and when I scream he hoots with laughter, and it drives me insane. I promise you he's getting his kicks deliberately trying to scare us like this, possibly because we're in a graveyard." "Are you sure it's him?" I asked, "and not a ghostly apparition of some kind?" "Don't be silly, Anastasia. Of course it's not a ghost. It's my brat of a brother, and this is so typical of him. Wait until I give him a piece of my mind." Suddenly we were being assaulted with even more acorns, and Olivia was growing visibly annoyed. "Give it up, Hank," she shouted. "We know it's you, and we're not the least bit scared, so why don't you go back home to little mummy?" While she was doing this, I quickly slipped away, because I had suddenly detected the loitering black shadow of Olivia's brother ducking behind a gravestone and peeking at us. I was taking care that he hadn't spotted me, and I crept quietly to the gravestone and pounced on him and grabbed him, holding him down as hard as I could. But to my surprise, he did not struggle or even try to escape. Instead, Hank made a strange, frightened, whimpering sound, like a terrified small dog that was being bullied by a bull mastiff. To my amazement, I was grabbing a bunch of hair, which I assumed was a warm coat of some kind that Olivia's brother was wearing, as rather strange one at that, I might add. "Got him, Olivia," I cried. "Your brother is over here. I've got him." I noticed Hank's strange fluffy coat smelt funky, like he'd not bathed for a long while, which didn't surprise me at all, because the reputations of little boys, I knew they would evade bathing at all costs. My friend came close with her flashlight, and the light lit up what we all believed was Hank. Much to our amazement and horror, it was not the mischievous Hank that I was actually holding down, but a terrified humanoid ape-like creature covered in long, flowing dark hair. I immediately retracted my handhold instantly, hardly daring to believe what I'd been pinning down. This curious anonymous creature was about 70 pounds, 1 foot wide and 3 foot tall, and it was covered all over its body with hair. It possessed a hairless, long, leathery face, and was eyeing us with terrified eyes, and looked just like a deer caught in headlights. I realized that this curious, funny little creature, with a naughty sense of humour, had been playing with us, but now that we'd actually caught him, he appeared to be very scared, reticent, and exceedingly shy. Suddenly we heard the most terrifying sound that sounded like a herd of rhinos gallivanting towards us at 100 miles an hour. Whatever this thing was, it was faster than a cheetah and swifter than the wind. It bolted unhesitantly towards us with defiant, feisty determination, and whatever this critter was, it was charging towards her youngling with a worrisome, rather frantic look on her face. The creature was clearly the young one's mother, because it was very obvious by how protective, assertive, and maternal she appeared. She let out a long stream of monkey-like chattering that sounded like she was giving her youngling a piece of her mind, and reprimanding him ever so severely. I could see the little creature looking sheepish, as if he knew he had misbehaved. The female critter grabbed her youngling, who proceeded to climb up his mother's back and sit with one leg dangling on either side of her shoulders. Suddenly the creature's reticence dissipated, and he sat there looking very jubilant, elated, and exceedingly pleased with himself. The mother glanced at us very briefly with a wary expression on her face that resembled an exhausted, exasperated mother who just about had enough of her child. Then she darted away very hurriedly. I sensed she didn't appreciate being seen by us. We watched her moving like greased lightning, and with such seamless grace. All the while she was chattering in a monkey kind of language that sounded like a mother giving her kid a huge telling off. I had not seen the mother very clearly, but she looked like a human, only with long flowing dark hair. But she was elephantine in size. I would say she was 10 feet tall, 900 pounds, and 4 foot wide, with very overlong arms that fell well below her knees. I could tell she was exceedingly sinewy and muscular, and had a very distinct cone-shaped head, and in her expressive deep-set dark eyes I observed a very distinctive red eye-shine in the dark. "What the heck was that?" asked Olivia excitedly. "What was it? What did we see? What was it?" "I have no idea," I said. Everybody started to talk all at once. We were so excited. We were in rapturous awe. "What did we see?" we kept asking each other. "What did we see? This was amazing." "Look what I found," I said, showing everyone a large deerskin filled with acorns. This was what the critter was throwing at us. He was a naughty little thing. We all marvelled at what we'd actually seen, and when we told our parents about our amazing encounter, our parents unambiguously dismissed our claims and emphatically ascertained that we'd been tricked by someone in a gorilla costume, or we'd seen a bear, but we had not observed what we claimed to have seen. All of us kids were quite simply disbelieved, dismissed, and misunderstood, but we all knew what we'd seen, and it was not an ape costume, nor by any strength of the imagination was it a bear. I think we all felt so frustrated and infuriated that no one believed our story, so we only talked about the encounter among ourselves, as everybody else clearly did not believe a word we said, and seemed to think that everything we said was fictitious and spurious. One Sunday evening my friends were smoking at a gravesite. We tended to pick a place to sit at random, as Olivia believed it was nice of us to sit around a gravesite that had not been visited for years by a solitary soul. She thought it was a kind, generous thing for us to do, as the dead person was long since departed, and their memory had died along with them. I think they might enjoy our company, she would say. I thought it was a very odd idea, but Olivia was very influential. "What a sad grave," said Olivia, sitting down on the grass and studying the grave curiously. She was using her flashlight to observe the grave closely. "Look, the engraving has all but been weathered away by time, and there is moss growing all over it, and the tombstone is so lopsided." "It must be from the 1800s or before then," I said. "Probably before then," said Olivia. Paula, one of my girlfriends, looked reflected as she started taking a puff of her cigarette. "Do you think we'll ever get to see that awesome human ape again?" she asked. "That little creature was so naughty and cute. I can't believe you actually thought it was Hank when you were pinning him down," she said to me. "It's amazing it didn't fight you back or run away or even bite you." "I'm surprised it didn't bolt away," I admitted. "I thought it would run away too when I saw what it was. It just seemed to cower in submission, and it seemed really afraid." "I don't think we'll ever see them again," said Olivia, reaching for a cigarette and taking a puff. "No, I think that mother's going to keep a stern eye on her little one from now on. I'm pretty sure of that." I could sense she wasn't pleased with the poor little critter. "He only wanted to play tricks on us, but I don't think he intended to be spotted by us." We were talking for a long time, and 3 of the 5 girls were smoking copious amounts of cigarettes and stubbing them out on the earth around the tombstone, creating a messing ashtray in the ground that was very unsightly and untidy. Suddenly I felt very certain that something was watching us. I could feel eyes on me, and I looked up to see this man standing yards away at us, goggling at us with a very annoyed look on his face. "There's a man watching us," I said. "Over there. Can you see? Look, there by the cedar tree." "I did not hear him come into the cemetery," said Olivia, looking up at the man in surprise. "How odd. You'd have thought we'd have heard him." I remember thinking the man was behaving very strangely, and his face looked unusually pale and white, and very distorted, and he looked like he was wearing a very, very heavy winter coat that rather reminded me of the German coats that were worn in World War II, which was strangely odd, because it wasn't even cold. The man stared at us for a moment longer, and then he appeared to disappear in the woods, which was also odd, because you don't exit the cemetery through the woods. "Wow," I said. "Did you see that? He went through the woods." "I wonder where he came from," asked Olivia. "Did anybody see?" It appeared that no one had observed a thing. We thought nothing more about the incident until the next morning, when Olivia informed me that she was woken in the middle of the night to find her bed shaking violently. For a moment she thought there was an earthquake, but she was soon to realise nothing else was happening in her home, which she found incredibly odd. She reluctantly returned to bed, and found her bed shaking all over again. So she looked up in alarm, and at the very end of her bed she saw the man from the graveside, who was standing there ogling her like he did at the cemetery. But then he vanished before her eyes, literally dematerialising. 1 second he was there, and then he was gone in a flash. I was so freaked out because I realised he had to be a ghost, she told me. We could not understand why the ghost had actually followed Olivia home, but the very next day it was Paula's turn to have an outer-worldly encounter. She claimed that in the middle of the night she felt something was sitting on top of her body, and it felt so heavy that for a moment she was struggling to breathe because the pressure on her chest was so huge. She screamed when she looked up, and then she observed the man from the cemetery, but she only saw his head and shoulders hovering above her body with a very disgruntled look on his face. He looked as mad as hell. "I've never been so terrified in all my life," she told us. "I ran to my parents' bedroom, and I couldn't go back to my bedroom." It did seem weird that the ghost of the man from the graveyard had visited 2 of my friends, but I was to discover he had not finished with his visitations yet. The final person to be visited by the ghost was my friend Kate. She said she was fast asleep when she was awoken to someone violently shaking her body so hard, as if they were trying to get her attention and wake her up. She got up in alarm, thinking that the house must be on fire or something, to see what was going on, and there she saw these shoulders and arms and a head of a man from the graveyard floating around the room like a hot air balloon, and she said he looked furious. And suddenly she found herself being pelted with cigarette stubs, and then the ghost just vanished and dematerialised before her eyes. We examined the cigarette stubs that had been thrown at over Kate's bed, and we could see some of them had Olivia's black lipstick marks on the end, so we knew where they came from. I think we were sitting at the grave of the man that died there, and our smoking and leaving our stubs at the graveside upset him, so he visited those of us that were smoking to raise his objection, said Olivia. I think we unintentionally disrespected him from beyond the grave by littering his gravesite with our stubs. This is the reason he visited those of us that smoke. I'm sure that's what upset him. What else on earth could it be? I suggested we went back to the grave the following evening to apologise and make amends and clean the area around the grave. I even cut some white roses from my mother's garden and placed them around the grave. Olivia began her apology. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I really didn't mean to stub my cigarettes around your grave or to be disrespectful at all. I'm truly sorry to cause you such offence." "I'm also sorry," said Paula. "I really am. I don't know what else to say. I didn't think about what I was doing." "I'm also sorry," said Kate. "I feel bad for being so disrespectful. I do hope you can forgive us." We were about to return home when we saw the ghostly man again. This time he was wearing a top hat, which surprised me enormously because I didn't know ghosts could actually change their clothes. He looked at us, bowed his head towards us, taking off his top hat in a very polite, congenial way, and the angry look on his face had all but dissipated, so I guess he had forgiven us for littering his grave with our cigarette stubs. We saw him, and then he disappeared before our eyes, and he never visited us again, so I truly think he accepted our apology. From that moment on, we made sure we brought ashtrays and respected the graveyard every time we went there for a girly chat. But our experience with the ghost did not put us off going to that cemetery again, I'm glad to tell you. I was to discover many years later that the creature that was toying with us in the cemetery was in fact a Bigfoot, or a Sasquatch, or a Yeti or hairy man. My claim to fame is I caught one, held one down, Now that's some accomplishment. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Niles and I have an absolutely extraordinary Bigfoot encounter to share with you that I consider to be one of a kind. My Bigfoot encounter happened in 1987 in the Ozarks when I was 30 years old at the time. Growing up, I'd always been considered the type of person that would never ever get married. My friends just believed I was not the settling down type. I had independently travelled extensively, especially all over North America. I loved camping, fishing, mountain climbing and canoeing. I taught wilderness survival skills once a week and also assisted the Boy Scouts from time to time, teaching them techniques such as tying knots and making campfires. I was in my element because I loved everything to do with the great outdoors, and life was an enormous adventure for me. Of course, at the time I was interested in girls, but dating was not something that actually appealed to me, and I was a disaster at chatting up girls. My biggest problem was that I was painfully shy, self-effacing, and exceedingly reserved. I was not a bad-looking fellow, and some women described me as a great catch, because I was rugged and handsome, 6 foot tall, an athletic build, dark hair and blue eyes. However, good looks are not enough to land you a good girl. It also requires the skill of a seductive, charming tongue, something I clearly lacked in my repertoire. I had been on multiple dates, all with disastrous, unfavourable outcomes. One woman went so far as to escape from me during our dinner by excusing herself by going to the bathroom and climbing through the back toilet window at the restaurant and making a hasty escape. We had sat there in cumbersome, somewhat awkward silence for a very long time, and I didn't know what the heck to say. And I know I appeared standoffish because I was so reticent and repressed. I remember I was completely tongue-tied at the time. I must have come across as a complete fumbling idiot, so I cannot say I blame her for running off like that. I gather she told her girlfriends that she would have had more fun with a piranha than with someone as timid and skittish as I was, because to her the gawky silence over dinner was utterly deafening. On another date, in agonizing nervous attempt to make polite, meaningful conversation, I commented on how much the woman was actually enjoying her food, and I meant it as a big compliment. I proceeded to boldly say that I could tell she loved her food because she looked remarkably healthy. The woman then threw a glass of wine in my face and told me she did not need a jerk like me in her life, and how dare I call her fat. I was not even suggesting she was fat, but there I was, putting my foot in it all over again. Then on another date set up for me by a friend of mine, it also inauspiciously ended in disaster. The woman was so fussy and punctilious about her order and kept sending all her dishes back to the kitchen, complaining bitterly all the time. I told you I want the dressing separate from the salad. Not on the salad. Are you stupid or what? She said to the waitress, explaining to me that she couldn't abide airheads. The waitress brought her the salad again with the dressing on the side that she had insisted upon, along with a glass of lemonade that she had also ordered. Once again my date exploded, saying, I told you I did not want a lemon piece in my lemonade. Why did you not listen? Are you deaf or something? I remember the poor waitress looked so belittled and humiliated as my date caused such a commotion about absolutely everything that even the customers at other tables were looking at each other and whispering among themselves, drawing uncomfortable attention to our table, which I could have well done without because I'm not the most attention-seeking exhibitionist at the best of times. When the waitress brought our main course, my date started to shriek at the waitress like a headmistress lecturing a pupil for very bad behaviour. I told you that I do not want any butter on my chicken breast. That's not butter, the waitress insisted. It's just lemon juice with a touch of parsley in it, I promise you. Do I look stupid? Went on my date in a raised voice. The waitress shook her head. Good, she said. Now take my chicken back and make it the way I ordered it. I watched the waitress scuttle away with a terrified look on her face, and her eyes were brimming with tears. Do you not think you were a little hard on the poor girl? I asked, leaping to the waitress's defence. I mean, she's trying her very best to give us good service, and I think she's doing a great job. She's trying very hard to please us. My date gasped at me in horror. "You are taking sides with the waitress," she said. "That's appalling. I'm your date, and you're treating that airhead better than me. You disgust me. You clearly do not know how to treat a lady right," she said. I watched her rising from her seat, grabbing her handbag and thrusting it under her arm. "Right, I'm out of here," she said, storming out of the restaurant in a huff, making a huge spectacle of herself as she swaggered off, delighting in the attention she was arousing among all the customers. "Tell that friend of yours to stop setting me up on such crap dates," she hissed, and she finally left the premises. I still remember an elderly couple looking at me so piteously on the opposite table, and the purple-rinsed elderly woman whispered to me, "You're better off without him, love." I settled the bill and raced out of the restaurant as fast as I possibly could. I don't think I've ever been so humiliated in my entire life. In that moment I decided that I would never, ever date again. One day at a local diner with a friend of mine called Mike, I met a very attractive brunette, a waitress called Celeste, and we went on a couple of dates together. She was a garrulous yet charming woman who loved talking about herself, which helped me significantly with my painful, reticent shyness, and to make matters even better, she never asked me about myself at all. At that time I did consider her lack of interest in me not a bad thing at all, because I absolutely hated talking about myself. I was young and naive at the time, so when she announced that we were going to get married a few months later, I guess I just went along with it. No one was more surprised than my betting friends, who had never believed it was remotely possible that I would ever tie the knot, given my painful, awkward shyness with women, and my huge passion for solo adventures in the American wilderness. Hardly an aspiring resume for a potential husband. Celeste and I settled down in a small apartment in Seattle that she turned into a cosy, glamorous den with designer furnishings and stylish wallpapers and fabrics. Celeste loved spending many nights out with her girlfriends and never minded me sauntering off on my wilderness excursions because she relished her own space. The reality was that at times in our lives we were sometimes like water and oil, and we didn't always mix together all that well. Well, not at that time, anyway. I was a manager at the time for a wilderness camping shop, selling all kinds of curious camping gear to outdoorsy, adventurous types of people, while Celeste was an interior designer helping people to recreate a glamorous home, and some of her clients were affluent, high society types that earned a great deal of money. I was passionate about my job because the store I worked for sold everything from rifles for hunting, outdoor clothes, hiking shoes, fishing rods, tackle, and all the accessories you could possibly need for camping. I would meet people like myself who were so passionate and excited about the great outdoors, and so my job always involved listening to the stories from people's camping adventures, and believe me, there were many, from strange ghostly encounters to weird sightings of unusual creatures and odd things that happened to them while they were camping. When I would return home at night to Celeste, she would happily talk about herself, prepare a delicious meal for the both of us, telephone her friends, and talk on the telephone for absolute ages about seemingly nothing of any real relevance at all. Then she would retire to bed or watch a little television with me. We really didn't communicate much in those days, nor did we share any interest in common, as Celeste was a social butterfly at the time, and I was introverted and outdoorsy. It was like we were two ships at the time passing in the night that didn't have much interaction together, but I always hoped that one day that would change. On one occasion, Celeste did present me with a hefty life insurance policy to sign. I think given the fact that you're always going off on wilderness excursions, I think it's wise to take out this policy, she advised me. If something dreadful, accidental or fortuitous were to happen to you, God forbid, and you were attacked by a bear or plunged to your death in attempting to climb a high ravine, I don't want to be left penniless, picking up the pieces of my life, especially if I'm a mother with children at the time. That would be awful. What she said was pragmatic and made perfect sense to me, so I signed the life insurance policy willingly as protecting my wife was a circumspect decision for any man in my position to make. As an outdoorsy type, I had experienced many near-fatal misses in my life that could ultimately have resulted in premature death. I hardly wanted poor Celeste to be an early widow, given that many of my ventures did involve high-scale, sometimes perilous risks. On one occasion I was nearly killed by a black bear, but I successfully played dead, and he lost interest in me. Another time I was stranded in an icy cold Arctic conditions after a nasty fall, and ended up nearly dying of hypothermia, and spent several weeks recuperating in hospital. One day I told my wife Celeste that I was going on a solo camping trip to the Ozarks, and as usual she was fine about my going. On the contrary, she seemed delighted to have me out of her hair for a whole week. I noticed that she seemed unusually interested about whereabouts I would be camping in the Ozarks, so I pointed to her an area on my map where I intended to go exploring. I was actually so pleased that she was showing some interest in my adventure and asking me so many curious questions about my trip and what I intended to do, as that was so out of character for her to appear so enthralled in my outdoor activities. Maybe she was becoming more inquisitive in my pursuits of my outdoor life, I thought happily to myself. Fast forward a couple of days and I was in my utter element. I was in the Ozarks, also known as the Ozark Mountain or Ozark Plateau, in the psychographic region of Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and the southeast corner of Kansas. The rocks that initially formed the Ozarks are made from sand and silt, with remains of marine animals that were laid down in a shallow sea about 542 million years ago. You can see some of the plant and marine-like fossils embedded within the rocks there when you go swimming in the rock pools, and it is extremely fascinating. Personally, I adore the Ozarks, and this was not my first solo camping trip out there. I loved the rugged rocky terrain, the exquisite foaming white plunging waterfalls, the caverns and pools of exquisite cool water, surrounded by magnificent rocky formations, often embedded with fossils like seashells and plant material. I also loved the rich terrain of the forest that consisted of primary white oaks, hickory and short-leaved pine, along with the river beds where you could find river birch, maple, sycamore, redbud and dogwood. The area was also teeming with wild animals from muskrats, deer, bobcats, otters, bats, and the occasional odd black bear. You also have to watch out for venomous snakes, like the cottonhead, coppermouth, and rattlesnakes, and invariably if you're swimming in one of those glorious rock pools, you'll often spot water snakes skirting across the water, which, believe me, is not an uncommon sight, and is very likely to be seen. It was on the third night camping, and it was very hot, humid, and muggy, which is pretty standard for the Ozarks in the middle of summer, even though tropical rain was common in these parts during the summer, so it could become cloudy and overcast very suddenly. I'm glad to say that luckily I'd not experienced a downfall yet. I was enjoying sleeping in an open hammock under the silvery stars at night. I set up in my sleeping quarters in a very inconspicuous, discreet private area between two white oak trees that were well hidden and extremely well camouflaged. The site was absolutely perfect because it overlooked a large rocky clearing over exquisite waterfalls and the most glorious rock pool that was the most incredible place to cool off in on a hot, scorching summer's day. What could be better? I hadn't prepared a tent for myself because I was really roughing it caveman style. I hid my huge rucksack under piles of leaves so that it remained invisible. I did not want my presence to be clear to the natural wildlife in the area, because when they sense humans are around, they keep a very safe distance. I loved wildlife and was desirous to be one with nature, so blending in with my environment was significant to me. It would seem that despite my near-death experience with a bear once, it had done little to curtail my huge appreciation for animals, and I could quite literally watch animals for hours through my binoculars, and if they sensed my presence, they would not hang around for very long, because invariably they are skittish around humans, and rightfully so. It was about 12 o'clock at night when I awoke, feeling incredibly hot, sticky, sweaty and clammy, so I decided to take a dip in the cool water at the rock pool. And as I plunged into the water, I felt so refreshed and invigorated. And then I heard it. It was the sound of two pairs of bipedal feet rushing through the undergrowth, walking towards the rock pool where I was actually swimming. I immediately hid in the water under the rocky ledge, taking care not to be observed. It was then that I saw two men, who appeared to be wearing military-style camouflage clothing known as fatigues, carrying powerful rifles in their hands. It was the conversations that they were having together that made my blood run cold. They were standing so close to where I was hiding that I could have literally reached out to touch their ankles if I'd wanted to. "Where the heck is he? How the hell are we going to take him down if we can't even locate him?" one of the men was saying. "I was informed that he's located in this area and should not be difficult to spot," came another man's voice. "Well, we need to get the job done as soon as possible on Maxwell Strick's orders, ASAP. Do you understand?" As I was listening to this conversation, I suddenly remembered the life insurance policy that Celeste had urged me to take out, and now I was listening to two men discussing how they were going to murder me. I was utterly horrified. Could this really be happening to me? My heart was racing and my hair stood up on the back of my neck. I felt so violently sick, I just wanted to throw up. I had heard of women who had killed their husbands for life insurance policies before, but I would never have considered Celeste to be that vindictive, malign or evil type of woman who was out for insatiably everything she could get her indulgent hands on. Clearly, I did not know her at all. I watched the men scouting the area and was so relieved that all my camping gear was so well concealed that you would have been forgiven for believing that the whole area was devoid of human habitation. I'd always camped this way before, and now this way of camping was quite literally saving my life. I've always had really great tracking skills, and so I wanted to find out as much as possible as I could about these men. Who on earth was Celeste hiring to kill me? It was absolutely extraordinary that she was going to such extreme lengths to do away with me. I knew I wasn't the greatest husband, but was a huge life insurance policy payout more pleasurable for her than my presence in her life? Such horrendous revelations was a huge slap in the face for me, as I began to realize what a sham my marriage actually appeared to have become. Just when I thought things were looking more promising in our relationship of late. The following day I was very cautious about all my activities, making sure that I did not do anything that could attract attention to myself, and I then heard the men all over again. This time I was in my hammock, well concealed from the clearing. Once again the men were walking towards the same rock pool where I had been swimming the previous night. "Where the hell is he?" I heard one of the men say. "How can something leave no trail whatsoever? How is that even possible?" "Well, maybe he knows we're trying to hunt him down." "I'm the best tracker in the business. I cannot go back to the base and admit that I've failed on this expedition. Failure's not an option for me. That's not going to look good on my meticulous military record. Maxwell has put his full trust in my professional expertise because he knows I can be relied upon to take care of business with no awkward questions asked. I'm considered the most reliable tracker in the military. Read the details again. I want to see if I've overlooked anything." The other man, who I will call George for the purposes of my story, fumbled around in his fatigued trouser pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper that had clearly seen better days. He unrolled the paper and read the following. "It's Operation Ozark Giant, sir. It's a tall human ape-like creature, sir, approximately 10 foot tall and 1,000 pounds and 5 foot wide, sir. It has 22-inch human-like footprints, sir, and is covered in head to toe with thick black hair, sir. It's powerful, strong, and exceedingly dangerous, with a very potent odour, and it's elusive, sir. Your instructions are to kill it, along with any existing family members, sir, if any are, of course, found. Best locations to look for it are around the Ozark waterfalls, open rock pools, nearby forest or caves, and look out for broken tree stumps and arch pieces of timber, sir." The other military man, who I will call Mike, stroked his moustache in a gesture of thoughtful contemplation. "I wonder why they want us to take him down. I wonder what he's done. Has the creature harmed anyone or caused any mischief? It strikes me that the report is extremely vague. Even that rogue bear that I took down last summer that was causing problems to the locals in the area, had a better report than this one is, which is about as indefinite as you can get. The whole thing strikes me as a rather spineless joke. What's the name of the giant creature, did you say? Sasquatch, sir. Mountain giant, said George. Give me the map again, snapped Mike. Where are we? I think we're at this precise point, sir, he said, noting it on the map. Maybe we should turn more to the eastern side of the valley. I think we've not investigated that area thoroughly enough. We can set up camp there tonight, and we can set up a night patrol, sir. I think the creature could potentially be nocturnal, which may be why he has eluded us so far. If he is intelligent, which is a very high probability, considering his distinct humanness, he could be erasing his footprints if he suspects that we are tracking him. Good point. But if this creature is as intelligent as you suppose he is, this expedition is turning out to be a bloody needle in a haystack. How the heck are we to find such an elusive, clever, intelligent creature? You tell me that. Once the men had disappeared from sight, I realised to my huge relief that they weren't actually looking for me, but were hunting some kind of peculiar humanoid ape. I'd been wrong about Celeste. She hadn't been intending to get me killed after all, I thought with huge relief. I determined that these men must be from some military base of some kind, and it sounded exceedingly odd to me that they were looking for such an anomalous, strange-sounding creature. I had never heard of such an atypical beast existing here in North America before. I had explored North America so very well, and knew all the animals in explicit detail that frolicked our woods, and a humanoid ape was definitely not one of those critters that I had ever encountered in all my travels. Surely this was some great big wind-up, I thought, chuckling to myself. Yes, that's probably what it was. The military were well known for their warped sense of humour, but this was possibly taking things a teensy-weensy bit overboard, as far as a wind-up was concerned. That night I retired to my hammock very early. I had made a fire pit, as I knew these men were far away by now. I killed a rabbit and skinned it, roasting it over the grill and flavouring it with my mixed seasoning. It tasted exactly like roast chicken and was melt in the mouth, juicy and delicious. I immediately pulled my fire pit apart and smoothed the area down and covered myself with a natural citronella lemongrass insect repellent and proceeded to lie down in my hammock, covering myself with a sopping wet towel. It was such a hot, humid night, and very difficult to fall asleep when the weather is this clammy and unpleasant, and the flying, biting insects don't make life any easier either, as far as acquiring a good night's sleep is concerned. I did manage to drift off to sleep with the help of my wet towel that helped my body temperature to plummet, thus enabling me to get some well-needed shut-eye. I was suddenly awoken to the loud noise of splashing in the water, and I could hear this strange chattering sound that sounded as if someone was speaking gibberish, but it sounded like several people jabbering all at once in this very strange language. There was also a horrible stench in the air that smelt a little bit like sweaty trainers and wet dogs. What the heck, I thought to myself as I sprang into action and gathered my Remington rifle. I crept silently through the trees, taking fastidious care to be as soundless as I could. I stepped ever closer to the rocky pool with the magnificent white foaming cascading waterfalls, and that was when I saw them. There were 4 massive creatures that at first glance looked exactly like bears, but then I realized they were more like human giants, covered with long, flowing dark hair. They were all playing together in the rocky pool excitedly, chattering together garrulously in a language of some kind, and the dialogue was continuous, as they seemed to love to chat. I realized at once that it was a mother, father, and 2 children, and they were without doubt the humanoid apes that those military men had been authorized and instructed and commanded to kill by their superiors at a military base of some kind. This very thought made me sick to my stomach, because to me killing these creatures was unequivocally tantamount to murder. The behaviour of these remarkable, powerful, loftic humanoids was so human-like, it was extraordinary. I kept up close to the rock pool, hiding behind a large rocky outcrop, to watch them very closely. They were the most unbelievable, exciting, curious creatures that I have ever encountered in my entire life, because they were incredibly intelligent. I was in luck because it was a bright full moon, and it was so light, and such a crisp, beautiful evening, with great visibility because of the starry firmament that provided the most phenomenal lighting over the rock pool. They clearly possessed human emotions and feelings, which was seen by the way they interacted together. They were tactile and affectionate, and very much a close, loving family unit. I could see that the alpha male, or father, was the authority, and he was titanic in his immense size and stature. I would say he was easily 11 foot tall, and well over 1,000 pounds, and possibly more, while the female was 8 foot, and the children only about 6 foot tall. The creatures were absolute incredible swimmers, and their long shaggy hair was surprisingly no hindrance at all to their swimming prowess and capability. I think they were hot on this muggy night, which was why they came to swim in the rock pool in the first place, and they all took it in turns to stand under the showering current of the waterfall. I could tell that they were really enjoying the feeling of the invigorating water pulsating across their bodies like an invigorating punnelling massage. I noticed that their hairless grey faces were so human-like, but with a prominent brow ridge and very deep-set brown eyes that appeared to take on a red eye-shine in the dark. The critters were really enjoying themselves splashing around in the water, and if you took away the long hair and reduced their sizes considerably, it would be no different to watching a human family interacting and playing together. Sometimes they would make these happy whooping sounds, which I would liken to jubilant, joyful human laughter. I watched the creatures climb out of the water with such grace and agility. They shook their shaggy-like coats like dogs, sending a shower of rain over a long rocky area. They continued to chatter together while gliding away on their long graceful legs, and they moved with such fluid grace and agility. They were superb to watch. Suddenly after they had gone, the revelation that these military men I had seen could potentially kill those beautiful creatures sent waves of horror and dread into every fibre of my being. It would be tantamount to murder in my book, and I knew that they had to be stopped. So I hatched up an inspirational, cunning plan in my head and went in search for the men, knowing that they were camping in an easterly direction. At first light I arose very early in the morning, and immediately, armed with my compass and map, I hiked for a few long hours with a rucksack on my back, until I found myself walking towards the campsite of the 2 military men. The 2 men appeared surprised to see me. "Who are you?" they asked me, looking at me in surprise. "Oh, I'm just solo camping out here," I said. "It's just nice to see another human face. It's been a long while, you see." I could see the men physically relax, and they warmly, cordially invited me to join them for a cup of tea around their fire pit. "So how long have you been out here?" Mike asked me curiously. "A while," I lied, "and I've seen some things I'd rather forget out here." "Such as what?" asked Mike, raising a quizzical eyebrow. "Well, you wouldn't believe me if I was to tell you," I said. "Tell us," said Mike, trying to hide his rising excitement that I could distinctly hear in his voice. "Well, I saw a couple of men killing a very big family of black humanoid hairy apes. I heard them say, 'We've cleaned the whole area out of these horrible critters,'" I said as I watched a horrified expression appear on Mike's face as he listened to me very intently. I continued, "I never knew that animals like this existed in North America before, but I did see these 4 dead corpses of these black hairy ape humanoids myself," I lied. "You saw them yourself? And are you sure they're dead?" asked Mike, failing to hide his delight. "Oh, yes," I said. "They were as dead as dodos, and these men loaded these colossal critters into a truck and sped away just like that." "Did they say where they were taking them?" asked Mike, looking frightfully concerned for a moment. "To be incinerated as quickly as possible," I said. "They wanted to keep what they'd done very, very hush-hush, away from prying and questioning human eyes, I gather, and they wanted me to keep my mouth shut too." "We believe your story," said Mike, looking very solemn, "but our advice is that you don't tell anyone what you saw, because people will think you're cuckoo, and should be locked away in a loony bin, if you get my drift." "Oh, I do," I said. "Most certainly." May I suggest that you don't tell anybody what you told us?" "Oh, you're right," I told them both. "I wouldn't tell anybody what I've told you. I think I just sensed you both would believe me, but normally I would never share such stories with anyone, lest they think I'm bonkers." "Glad to hear it," said Mike. "How can you be sure those creatures are dead?" he continued. "Are you really certain of this fact?" "I've been a hunter all my life," I said. "I think I can tell when an animal is dead or when it's just passed out." The men seemed satisfied by my adamancy. I drank my tea and ate a couple of chocolate biscuits that they had given me. I then left the men and thanked them for their hospitality, and then I proceeded to hide behind the cover of a tree to listen to their conversation and to make absolutely certain that they would not consider hunting down those beautiful humanoid apes. I hoped that my bogus story had convinced them that the humanoid apes were indeed dead. "Well, it would seem someone has taken care of our job for us," said Mike. "I told you that those critters were no longer around. I would have discovered their tracks by now. Did I not tell you? It's just as well we ran into the man, and he told us that the critters are clearly dead, or we could have been running around in circles for ages, looking for those things, with absolutely no results." "Yes, boss, it would appear so." "Now you're not to tell anyone that we did not kill those Ozark giants ourselves. We will simply tell them we've taken care of business. That's all we need to say. That way we'll be esteemed very highly and even promoted. So no divulging any details about this case. Do you understand? Why should some stranger take credit when the army would not know the difference anyway? So no spilling the beans. Get my drift?" "Oh, of course, sir," said George. "We'll simply say we attended to business, like you say, sir." "Good man," said Mike, tapping him on the back in a condescending way. "I knew I could trust you." I watched the two men pack away their tents into their rucksacks and leave the area, falsely believing that the humanoid apes had indeed been killed. So there you are. That's my extraordinary story. And I'm glad to say that I played my part in hopefully saving that beautiful family of forest giants that deserved a life just like the rest of us do. You'll be surprised to learn that all these years later I am still married to Celeste, and it would appear that over the years our relationship literally blossomed. Initially we had so very little in common, and it really looked doubtful that our relationship would work, but then suddenly one day it just did. I fell madly in love with her about 10 years into our marriage. She suddenly changed, and I guess I did too. Maybe we just grew up, matured, and instead of growing apart, we grew together. I think Celeste overcame her self-centered behavior and developed a more spiritual attitude to life. She developed into a very beautiful woman over the years, and I loved her more than ever. I always tell her that she improved with age, rather like a good quality wine. At first she was fruity, light, and rather naive, but now she's full-bodied, mature, and infinitely superior. I'm also glad to report that I do not go on camping trips alone these days, because Celeste has developed a passion for outdoor adventures and excursions, and she adores visiting the Ozarks as much as I do, and swimming in those glorious rock pools, and cooking gnocchi and garlic and parmesan in a pot over a warm grill. Oh, and I do still have a hefty life insurance policy taken out on me, but I assure you that if Celeste wanted to do away with me, she'd have done away with me a very long time ago. She relentlessly teases me about the time that I thought she had hired someone to kill me or do me in. I now know all these years later that the creatures I encountered in the Ozark were indeed Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti or Hairy Man, and I do realise how remarkably privileged I was to have such an amazing encounter with these incredible hairy critters that I believe are the most wonderful creatures. I am sure, much like the human species, you get good and bad creatures, but the family I watched playing in the rocky pool so happily together was no threat at all to human safety. I am certain of this fact, or I wouldn't have gone so far or to such extraordinary measures to protect them from the military. So that is my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.